Good evening, everyone. I am calling our special board meeting to order on today, April 28th. Will you please call the roll?
President Adair,
Present.
Ms. Beckerly,
Present.
Mr. Brown,
I'm here.
Mr. Cole,
Here.
Dr. Pierce, Vice President Reyes.
Here.
Hey. There she is.
Hey.
And Ms. Vera.
Here.
You have a quorum?
Thank you. And I believe Dr. Pierce is going to be late. She's in a task force meeting, so.
They trying to be in the same room with me. I show up in person and you disappear.
All right, so board members, on our agenda tonight, we get to spend some time with AJ in person. Yay! So that is what we have on our agendas to have facilitated discussion on several of our governance kind of tasks, and we'll be with AJ for the evening, and that is really all we have. So is there a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
Any additions, changes, questions? Without objection, the agenda is approved. And I'll go ahead and turn it over to AJ. Hi.
Hey, good evening.
Good evening.
It is always a joy to be back with you all. Thanks for having me. The biggest topic we're going to dive into this evening is evaluation, and evaluation of two different sorts. The board self-evaluation and superintendent evaluation. And really start to make sure that the board's absolutely crystal clear about what is effective superintendent evaluation, but then also give the board an opportunity to self-evaluate. Am I doing the wrong thing? Okay, there we go. To make sure the board's really comfortable with its own performance and comfortable with how will its process be eventually for measuring superintendent performance. But before we dive into it, it's important to get some understanding of why. Why would a board self-evaluate? Why would a board do that?
Continuous improvement.
Definitely about continuous improvement. There's a whole series of themes related to that we're about to dig into. That is at the top of the list, continuous improvement. Why would a board self-evaluate?
Accountability.
Accountability. Accountable to who?
Everyone.
Pretty much. You got a whole lot of bosses out here, and I think they have a right to know, are our representatives getting better at representing our vision and values, staying the same or actually declining? Yeah. What else? Why would a board self-evaluate?
Set a good example, serve as a role model.
Lead by example, modeling. This is a huge part, and this actually ties back into what Michael's describing about continuous improvement. If what the board wants is to see a culture of continuous improvement throughout the organization, then one of the board's most powerful access to that is to actually model it. Why would the board want to model a culture of continuous improvement? Why would that be important?
That's what we're asking the organization to do.
Yeah. Like when it comes down to it, if we actually want teachers, if we want to improve student outcomes, at the end of the day, the number one strategy for that, the number one lever we have to pull is how do we improve the quality of instruction that students are experiencing? The higher quality instruction that students are experiencing, the faster we're able to improve student outcomes. And so anything we can do to improve the quality of instruction students are experiencing, this is a powerful access to improving student outcomes. And probably your second biggest lever that you can pull is what's the quantity of quality instruction that students are experiencing. So on one hand, we're trying to increase the quality of instruction. On the other hand, we're trying to increase how much quality instruction students experience. And pretty much everything you do around this table ultimately filters into one of those two strategies. But both of those strategies do in fact hinge on the quality of instruction improving. Having a higher quantity of lackluster instruction isn't actually particularly useful. What is having a higher quantity of quality instruction. And so because these are your two key strategies and they both rely on the constant improvement in the quality of instruction, we've got to be thoughtful about what are the things that actually help drive improvement in instructional quality. As it turns out, continuous improvement is the correct answer. That when folks think about what is it that we want students to know and be able to do, let's come up with a goal for exactly what that should be, and then let's implement a strategy, create a plan to accomplish that goal. Let's implement the plan, and then let's evaluate to figure out how it all worked out. And then wash, rinse, and repeat, and do the whole thing all over again. That's the continuous improvement cycle, and you want every teacher in the district on that cycle. You want every educator. You want all your principals on that cycle. You certainly want your superintendent on that cycle. And the board's access to really creating that as a cultural norm is for the board to demonstrate it's on that cycle as well. That the board says, here are the behaviors that we want to demonstrate because of their alignment with improvements in student outcomes. Let's come up with a plan to accomplish those behaviors, and then let's measure how we're doing relative to that. And then, after we've done all of that, we'll figure out where we're at, and then we'll make another plan, and then we'll implement that, and then we'll evaluate that, and then on and on and on. When the board is prepared to humble itself and demonstrate a commitment to continuous improvement, you really create a safe space for all staff. Like, the last thing any staff want is to have a culture of, I want to see you do right, but I don't have to get right. I don't have to take the risk of having an honest conversation about my performance, but you have to take the risk of having an honest conversation about yours. That is not the culture you want. And so it's important the board self-evaluate. Back in 2014, the council actually did a massive study nationwide where he sent out a survey to all the board members and superintendents across the nation. And we asked them a whole bunch of questions, and then when the data came back, a bunch of the data analytics nerds at the council went to comparing that with student growth rates across the country to figure out what type of board behaviors had a stronger or weaker correlation with rates of student growth. And one of the most interesting findings in that study was that students who were served by boards that self-evaluated at least once a year tended to grow at a faster rate than students who were served by boards that had not self-evaluated the previous 5 years. That's correlational study. This is not causation. Don't get too excited. but I think that there was such a meaningful correlation there. Suggests that the board's behavior in the boardroom does in fact echo in the classroom. The boards that engage in meaningful self-evaluation, not self-serving self-evaluation. Like, do we feel like we've been a great board this year? And then everybody who agrees with the direction the board's going, oh, absolutely. And everybody who disagrees, like, no, not at all. That's not useful. Like, do we actually have a set of behaviors that we're benchmarking ourselves against? That's the nature of what we're going to do. The first thing we're going to do this evening is go through the board self-evaluation. To get there, the first thing you need to do is pull up a document. This is a document you all seen. It's the Student Outcomes Focused Governance Manual. The easiest way to get there on your device is to go to tinyurl.com/SOFG-manual. The easiest way to get there is go to tinyurl.com/SOFG-manual. That's tinyurl.com/SOFG-manual. It's also being shown on the screen because they're a really clever technologist here.
They are.
And when you get there, you just have to flip in, I think it's maybe page 2, and you get to the first page of the instrument. You'll know that you're there because there are 4 multicolored columns. In those columns, and there are several pages in this instrument, and each page describes a set of behaviors that school boards can engage in that in the research literature have some correlation with improvements in student outcomes. What we're going to do is we're going to walk through this instrument and really evaluate where is the board at today, and then we're going to go back through it a second time to figure out, okay, so now that we're clear about where we're at, let's talk about where we want to go. All right, so
One more time with the link, please.
Yeah, it's tinyurl, tinyurl.com/SOFG, as in Student Outcomes Focused Governance, -manual, MANUAL. So this manual is broken up into 6 different pages. We're going to walk through each of these 6 pages. The first 3 we're going to spend a lot of time on. The latter 3 we'll move through more quickly, and it'll be abundantly clear why. Did that work for you, Eric? And so the first page of this board self-evaluation instrument is labeled Vision and Goals. And it says the board will, in collaboration with the superintendent, adopt goals that are student outcomes focused.
So it's really page 3.
Oh, it's page 3, thank you. Page 3. On my screen, it's not even showing me pages, so I guessed poorly. Yeah, but there we go, page 3. The vision and goals. Now, let's take a look at it. And again, I know a lot of you have seen this before, but let's just, I want to be thorough. You'll notice that there are 4 different columns. Behaviors that are not student outcomes focused, behaviors that are approaching a focus, that are actually meeting a student outcome focus, and behaviors that are really demonstrating a mastery of a focus on student outcomes. You also notice that they are numbered. Why do you think they're numbered differently?
Weighted.
Yeah, they're weighted. It suggests that some behaviors of the board actually reflect a stronger correlation with improvements in student outcomes than others. But you as a board, you want to go as far to the right as possible. You don't want to be approaching a focus. You really want to be mastering a focus. And so the first thing we do is we look at this, is we start on the left side and we work our way to the right to figure out which column represents how far we've made it. And this is a linear journey here. So first you have to look at the red column and figure out, is any of that true? And if none of that's true, then you move to the approaches focus column. And if everything there is true, then you move on to meeting focus. But if anything on meeting focus isn't true, then that means you're back on approaches focus. So what I want you to do is take a moment, starting from left to right, go through this. Which column describes how far this governing team has made it so far on vision and goals? The board will, in collaboration with the superintendent, adopt goals that are student outcomes focused. Which column best describes how far the board has made it? Take a moment to review. In a few moments, we'll ask folks to share. Ramona, just checking in. You with us?
I don't think she's not feeling well today.
Gotcha. All right. So who will be the first to share? Where do you think this governing team is? Yeah, Eric?
I think that we're pretty solidly in the green area of meeting student outcomes focus.
Why meeting and not mastering?
In part because I didn't get through reading all of those.
That's part.
But in addition, I'm not comfortable, based on what I know, and that's the top column, we're not there yet.
Gotcha.
I just,
Yeah. Michael?
I would agree with Eric. I think the reason that we wouldn't be in the blue and mastery is that, one, we're still learning this process. We're still moving along and adopting this. The second piece is that there's a sign at the bottom about root cause analysis. I still think that we have quite a bit of continuous improvement work to do in that space of understanding root cause, particularly as it relates to adult behavior impact on student outcomes.
Yeah. This is always an area of continuous improvement for the governing team, for the management team. Is how are we analyzing the data and really getting an understanding of not merely what we're experiencing, but what is most at cause of what we're experiencing that we have control over. That is a constant struggle to get really, really good at identifying that. Yeah, anyone? Yeah, Carol.
I just want to say that I'm proud of us because I think we have everything but that final paragraph in the blue column.
Yeah.
And that's pretty cool. And I would suggest even further that I think the discussions that we're having during the monitoring report are getting us much more closer to discussing and getting at the root chords, like just the way we've been peeling back the layers on attendance. Like, we're starting to really almost mastering. We're really close to mastering.
I got to tell you, your last monitoring report that, among other things, lifted up some of the concerns around attendance, but then really showed the data that leads the administration to believe that there's a strong correlation between non-attendance and non-accomplishment of the goals. It was an incredibly compelling monitoring report that I have shared with many, many, many other districts around the country and say, look, if your level of analysis is not on point like this, step your game up. And so in that regard, you all are definitely leading the way and serving, as exemplars for a lot of other school systems across the nation. A lot of other large urban districts are busy taking notes and saying, well, hold on, what's Columbus doing? Well, let's get with that. In fact, I know certainly, because they've reported back to me, of multiple districts who've called the staff here asking for advising and insights on the work that you all are doing, particularly not only with your monitoring work, but also with your Portrait of a Graduate work. That is very inspirational. Many people have wanted to do what you've done, but didn't have the courage or the gumption, to go in on it, partially because the path you all have taken is not promised. It's not a path that has been well trodden, and so you all are exploring an area that other people have been too concerned to explore. And so what's happening is everybody's now watching. Well, hold up, what's Columbus coming up with so we can go copy some of their homework. But that reality emerges out of the board's willingness to set goals around it, and then monitoring and challenging the administration to monitor progress relative to it. And so I'm excited about the extent to which you all are increasingly seen as exemplars nationwide in some of this work.
Thank you. I'm waiting for the swing of the paddle, though.
Yeah.
No.
I'm in the cut. Like, what's coming?
About to come.
We'll get to monitoring later. Any other reflection on vision and goals? All right, vision and goals is the first page. Let's move to the second page. And so it sounds like the consensus is around meeting focus for vision and goals. If you're a note taker, I'd write that down and go ahead and score yourselves 25 points for that one. And then we'll keep it moving. Values and guardrails. Take a moment to read through values and guardrails. Where's your board on values and guardrails? The board will, in collaboration with the superintendent, adopt guardrails that represent the values of the community. Take a few moments to read through it. Who'll be the first to share? Where do you think we are in values and guardrails? Yeah, Eric?
I think here we're not quite as far along. I think that we have a good handle on what's orange approaching. And we have done many of the things in the green, but I don't think that we've accomplished all of those things. I don't know that we've had conversations or yet adopted theories of action and looked at those in the way described in this paragraph or in this green colored area.
So from that analysis, you described that the current status is approaching, but with just one or two details worked out over the next 3 months, you could pretty quickly jump to meeting or mastering.
I think that's true.
Gotcha. Anybody else? Where are you at? Yeah, Carol?
I just have a quick question. In the first criteria in green says the superintendent has provided interim ending point, guardrail ending points for each year. And we had a few where we all agreed that you had to create the budgeting system first or create the tool. So the first few years we don't have ending points because we're giving time. So do you count that as a failure of that criteria, or is that inherent in the process?
So are these brand new measures?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so we largely ignore that if
Okay,
the measure
good.
hasn't ever existed, because then you have very little predictive quality until you get 2 data points. But once that happens, then I would absolutely expect the superintendent to do this. But for brand new metrics, that is really, really, really challenging to do. And so that's the way I differentiate. So things that we've had data for a while, I'd have that expectation. Things that we haven't had data for a while, then that's something I would expect the administration to come up to make sure that they fill in after you've gone through 2 reporting periods, because then you've got 2 data points, and now you've got a little bit better sense of what the likely trajectory will be.
So then I'm with Eric. I think the thing that's stopping us from doing is the theories of action.
Anybody else? What are you thinking?
I agree with that.
I think we're lime green. But I think that we're beginning. I won't say that. I'll say that there's growth opportunity because we actually did have a conversation about theories of action in the last interim report.
Right.
We actually did. She discussed pretty thoroughly what they were looking at in terms of engaging this attendance issue, and then took action on it not that long after. So I think that there's opportunity to grow, but I would say that we've touched that category.
Well, and one thing to be clear is that what's described here is the board has considered adoption. It doesn't actually say you have. So often what happens is people think it through, and it's like, you know what, none of these really make sense for us as a board to really codify into the DNA of the district, whereas other times they do. So I'm thinking of one particular district. They have a very specific continuous improvement model. And the board's perspective, and they've been executing against this over the last decade. The board's committed to it, the administration's committed to it. But their longtime superintendent, starting to talk about, hey, maybe I got 5 years left. We need to start thinking about transitioning. And so one of the things the board did is they, codified the tenets of their kind of homegrown continuous improvement process into a theory of action, because they wanted to be clear, whoever the next superintendent is, we don't want you to bring your own theory of action. We're hiring you to implement this particular managerial theory of action. And so there are reasons that school boards would consider this and choose to proceed. There are reasons school board look at it as like, you know what, there's nothing that is so central to our DNA that we need to codify. But sometimes there is, and so you do. So just note that it doesn't say you have to have a theory of action. It just says we've had the conversation and we either decided to proceed or we decided not to.
And in this case, by theory of action, we mean overall top level
Yes.
There were theories of actions that came up in the monitoring reports to address that specific goal.
Yeah, no, and this is really referring to, high-level strategic direction, that, impacts at the level of the system. That is designed to, this is our DNA for how we pursue results in the school system. And so a common thing is when school systems have a really strong bend toward decentralization or a really, really strong bend towards centralization. Those are type of things that are just really huge aspects of a school system's DNA. Like if your stock and trade is that every single school would do their whatever they need to do and it's completely differentiated, no two schools are the same. And if you believe in that as your model for improving student outcomes, the last thing you want to do is hire a superintendent who comes in and says everybody should be doing the exact same thing every day. Similarly, and I'm actually thinking of two districts that are right next door, have very similar populations they serve. And one of them, that's essentially a theory of action. It's hyper decentralized. We got all these 100 schools and everybody does their own thing. And then the district next door is almost as large, and they are hyper focused on every single school. If you go from this third grade to that third grade to that third grade to that third grade in the same day, you're going to see the same set of instruction. And the teachers in the first district would say, if you tried to give them structured lesson plans, they'd say, well, this is ridiculous. You're infringing on my creative freedom as a teacher. How can I possibly teach this way? And the teachers in the second district, if you try to take away the structured lesson plan, well, this is ridiculous. Like, how can I focus on teaching kids if I got to focus on writing curriculum and, you're not giving me the structure I need to be great for kids? And both of them believe very strongly in their respective theories of action. And in both cases, hiring a superintendent who was completely disconnected from whatever their thing is in that district would probably be chaotic. Like, you won't get teachers from District A to go to District B because it's like, nope, I want my creative freedom. And you definitely won't get teachers from District B to go to District A because, like, those people are just anarchy. They're not about kids. How can you possibly focus without having, structures? And that's perfectly fine. And in both cases, the boards have said we need to codify our theory of action so that folks know that when you come to this district, you are buying into this particular approach. Yeah, Christina?
No, I think just hearing your explanation of the theories of action would definitely lead me to believe that we are in the orange, because I think we've had some conversations, going to Board Member Cole's point, related to theories of action specific to the interim report, but from a high level, based on how you just described it, I think there definitely needs to be more conversation there.
Yeah. All right, so for values and guardrails, it sounds like the consensus that we're approaching, but there also sounds like there's some keen ideas on what could be done to rapidly move to meeting and mastering. Got it. Let's check out page 3, monitoring and accountability. Where is the board? Where is this governing team on monitoring and accountability? Welcome.
I have it. AJ, this one's kind of easy, I think.
Oh, yeah?
Well,
Where do you think you are?
I think that we are at the very beginning of the yellow, actually, because we haven't yet consistently hit the goals. We're very well aware of them, and we have our calendar, but we're still working on figuring it out. And the superintendent's evaluation is not yet solely based on the goals and guardrails, just more so because of timing. But so we don't have everything accomplished yet in the yellow, so we can't say that we are fully approaching.
Got it. Anybody else? Where's the governing team at on monitoring and accountability? We've got one vote for, if we haven't completed all the items in approaching, then that puts us in the previous column. So essentially we have one vote for not focused yet, but with some clear insights into what are some steps we'd have to take to get there. Anyone else? Where is this governing team on monitoring and accountability? Yeah.
I think that there's somewhat of a blend between us being in the yellow and in the green, in the approaching and the meets. That area where I see us in the meets is specifically the 25% discussion piece. You know, I think once we look at, and we kind of tabulated those numbers, once we look at where we are within the first quarter of the year, I think that we spent, you know, a fair amount of time having conversation and monitoring of something. I mean, January, we spent quite a bit of time in a special board meeting where we discussed the interim guardrails and kind of came to a conclusion as to what we want to see moving forward. Yeah. I think that we've spent considerable time between special meetings with you to train. In addition to that, those discussions, whether it has been the monitoring of our guardrails, interim guardrails, I feel like we're at or very near that 25% mark.
We're at 13% for the quarter.
Well, close.
Close. Hey, 13 is a lot closer than 0. And I mention that because when we started on this journey, you know, more than 18 months ago now, or somewhere in that range, we were in fact at 0. None of the board's time was meaningfully being used to monitor progress relative to goals, partially because there wasn't clarity about goals, and even where there was some sense of commonality around goals, which at that time was, you know, portrait, there wasn't any clarity around what are performance metrics relative to that, and the board certainly wasn't spending its time monitoring progress relative to those nascent, you know, metrics. So we've essentially gone from 0 to 13. So we are in fact trending in the correct direction. However, given our previous conversation, the intention here is what is the culture we want to create? And simply what there is to recognize is 13% does not create the culture that you all mentioned earlier that you want to create. It's not going to drive the degree of cultural alignment with continuous improvement that you all intend. You know, for that, you're going to have to get that number, you know, considerably higher. Our encouragement, obviously, you know, in demonstrating a masterful focus on student outcomes, suggest. Oh, well, somebody read the first indicator under mastering focus.
Board invests no less than 50% of its total board-authorized public meeting minutes each month into effectively monitoring its goals.
Okay, so actually there's something really interesting in this. How is that expectation, what are two important differences between the expectation under mastering focus and the exact same expectation under meeting focus? What are the two big differences? So one is the obvious one, it's numeric.
Right.
From 25% to 50%, that's a huge difference. We're doubling the amount of time that we're actually focused. What's the other big difference between the two?
The effectively part?
Yeah.
The
It's actually, you actually have to be effective.
Yeah.
Yeah, Ramon, it's not enough to say, oh, well, we did something.
Right.
The question is, were you effective? How do you know if you were effective at monitoring?
We score ourselves.
Yeah, you actually have an instrument for evaluating were we effective or not. Earlier, Michael was like, is there a paddle on the other side of this praise? And I said, wait till we get to monitoring. Well, now you know now you know what I meant. Is that there are two major challenges this board has. is one, that you've got to figure out how do we prioritize our time such that we're investing more focus on our children actually learning, and where they are and aren't, what is our superintendent doing about it? What is the strategy for addressing that? And what changes in adult behavior do you have to drive as a superintendent? What changes in adult behavior do we have to offer supports for and drive as a board? So step one is you want to get beyond 13%. And step two, much of that 13% is not yet at the level of effective. So if we're talking about how much time was spent on monitoring, sounds like 13%. If we're talking about how much time was spent on effective monitoring, that is a smaller percentage. Maybe half of that, and so it's not. So when we talk about are we demonstrating a mastery of being focused on student outcomes, it's not just do we put in the time, it's do we put in the time effectively. This is like in basketball. If the coach says, "Hey, you're not very good at free throws. I need you to practice." And so then if I get in there and I just kind of throw the ball up at the hoop like this, I'm technically practicing, but am I practicing effectively? No. And so you can practice without being effective. This says, no, we don't count that. We only count effective monitoring. And so that's the challenge, is that you're going to have to not only grow in your focus, but you're also going to have to grow in your effectiveness while being focused. Yeah. Carol.
And is it the same rule in terms of I'm looking at the rubric now for whether we've been effective or not. You have to hit all of them in the column in order to be considered effective again? Because I think we were kind of bouncing back and forth.
No, so generally what I call is if the majority of them are ineffective, usually that's it. And then the only other question is if of the ones that aren't effective, if the majority of those are highly effective rather than ineffective, then I'd say you're at effective. But if you got there, so there are 5 indicators. If 3 of them are effective but 2 of them are ineffective, I'd say at best you're probably approaching, but you're definitely not ineffective yet. But as long as the majority of them are effective or better, then I'd say you're good to go. And so if you've got 1 at ineffective, but 3 at effective and 1 at highly effective, I'd say you're good. But yeah, it will take a lot of practice. In the same way that you expect your teachers to put in the practice it takes to get really good at their PLC work. Really, you all have a rubric that you use to identify whether a PLC was of quality or not.
Somewhat, yes.
So a number of the districts that I work with, they have really very stringent rubrics that say here's how you know if this PLC was of quality, and so it's not just did we get together and talk about stuff, because sometimes a PLC could be we got together, we talked about how much of a headache little AJ is, and I would say that's not an effective PLC. But if we got together and said, yeah, little AJ, we got some issues there. Oh, here's what it says in the data, and here, let's talk about what we're going to do about it. That's a different story. And so in the same way that you don't just want your teachers putting in time talking about stuff, you really want them to be effective in their discussions around how are we serving children. Same thing here. You don't just want to put in time. You actually, as a board, want to be effective in your discussions about how is your system serving children. Yeah, Eric?
What's PLC?
I apologize. So yeah, in the same way that this is a professional learning environment for the board, what often we do is we have teachers come together in a professional learning community to grow in their practice as well. And so I often think of the monitoring work as the professional learning community at the governance level, in the same way that we want teachers involved in professional learning communities, PLCs, at the school level, and at the often at the elementary level, their PLCs will often come together. With all the 3rd grade teachers will come together and study and practice together. All the 4th grade teachers. At the secondary level, it's often by subject. But either way, it's professionals coming together to learn in community. That's really the same thing that's happening when you're monitoring. And so you want those sessions with the teachers to be quality. You have to demonstrate what that looks like by having the sessions here in the boardroom be quality. Yeah, Carol?
And I think just for clarification, Talisa, am I right? We call them TBTs?
Yes,
Yeah, and BLTs,
and BOTs.
Oh, what are those?
teacher-based teams and building level teams.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense.
Correct. And they do to give feedback on how to strengthen those, and as well as our overall professional development.
Yeah, yeah, teacher-based teams and building-based teams. Yeah, same work.
Yep.
Same work.
And then I fear that I may be one of the culprits as to why we're not getting better scores. So
Not there yet.
top level feedback, like, is it that too many of our questions, meaning my questions, have too much discussion ahead of time, or what would you say?
Yeah,
Where are our failings?
yeah. So two things, and neither of these will be new because I've mentioned both of these to you. Number one, preparation. Don't show up not having done your homework. In the same way that you don't want your students to show up having done no preparation, you don't want your teachers to show up having done no preparation. As a governing team, you can't show up having done no preparation. So for a monitoring session to really be of quality, you need to have read through the report in advance and submitted questions to your superintendent in advance. So that's step one, is did we actually show up fully ready by having read through it and submitted questions in advance? And similarly, when we get into some of the guardrails and we move over to the stands round, it's going to be the same question. Did you read through the monitoring report in advance, the guardrail monitoring report, and did you send them questions in advance? Or did we just show up and wing it? When you show up and wing it, you may be able to obfuscate that from each other and maybe from anybody else watching. I guarantee you cannot hide it from me. Like I just watched too many school board meetings. I can tell when board members have actually spent time caring about children in the previous week and folks who spend time doing other things. Spend your time making children a focus by doing the preparation. And so in the main thing that means is reading through the monitoring report, thinking through what questions do I have, and also being intentional about categorizing those questions into the three big buckets that we've offered you. Are these technical questions? Hey, I noticed that this exam, is about this. How often do we administer this exam, or what percentage of students took this exam, or psychometrically, is this exam aligned with? Those are technical questions. Those are important to ask. I recommend you ask them, but they do need to be asked in advance. You don't want to spend all of your strategic time as a board dealing with technical matters that could have been asked in advance. The second bucket is tactical. Hey, which schools did we deploy this particular intervention to? Do we deploy it to all of our elementary schools or just elementary schools? Those are tactical questions. Those are really, what was the questions about implementation? How were things deployed? Did teachers, have they had training in this yet? Those are really tactical questions. And those should be asked. Those should be asked in advance because you don't want to spend all the board's time on tactical issues when you all are here to be a strategic body. You're really here to have generative dialogue around the strategies of the school system, not dive into did Mr. Johnson, deploy this particular curriculum this week. Like you don't want to be in a tactical place. You want to be in a strategic place. And part of how you get there is you ask your tactical questions in advance. You submit those to the superintendent at least 3 days in advance. And then the third bucket is where you really want to live. And that's strategy. You really want to know, and strategy is really asking the question, what are we going to do about what the data is telling us? Like is a big picture, what are the big bets that staff is making are going to make a difference on the data that we're experiencing? The data the data that tells us what's happening with our students, what are the big bets that staff is making that are really going to make a difference on those? That's where you really want to spend. That's where you really want to spend a lot of your time, because that's where you're going to, as a board, going to have the biggest impact. Really having those strategic conversations here at the dais around here. First, let's understand what the data tells us, and then let's really understand what is the management team's response to that data. And so of those three, technical, tactical, and strategic, it's easy to tell who's done preparation because folks who have poorly prepared, folks who instead of spending time doing your job and caring about children during the previous week, you were doing something else other than caring about children, which is fine. But then instead of trying to sort that out in advance, you shut up and started asking all your technical and tactical questions here in the board meeting. That is a dead giveaway that you did not prepare. And that is harmful. That is harmful because it doesn't allow you to have the quality of dialogue that you all really need to have in order to hold your superintendent accountable, your management team accountable, and to really drive performance for your students. So that is item number one, is preparation. That is by far, I think the biggest shortcoming that I've seen on this board so far is that there's a lot of behavior that to me looks like we simply didn't prepare in advance. We didn't read the monitoring report, or we didn't ask questions in advance, or in some cases, superintendent, provided answers, and we clearly didn't read the answers to the questions in advance. Preparation is your best access to effective monitoring. So that's the really big one. Beyond that, beyond the preparation. The other biggest thing that comes to mind when I'm watching your monitoring reports, and to be fair, you all have gotten much better at this, is actually focusing on understanding the reality for students rather than focusing on opining about what I think the reality should be for adults. Focusing on understanding the reality for students rather than opining on what I think the reality should be for adults. So this is again, you all were very typical of the average board when we started, and that there was a lot of energy around. Hey, well, have you thought about doing this, Madam Superintendent? Have you thought about doing this? What about this? Have you considered doing these things? And then over time, you got a little bit savvier about all of your recommendation and advising, and started trying to ask trick questions to obfuscate the fact that it was clearly a suggestion. Oh, well, would more engagement with parents, would that make a difference? Okay, that sounds like a question. That is clearly a recommendation. And so you've gotten a little bit savvier about not doing your jobs. But what I would coach is actually just do your jobs, which is to, instead of focusing on what do I think the future should be for adults, really focusing on what is the reality right now for our students. And what do you, as our, instructional leader, what are you doing in response to that current reality? So that's the second thing, is just having much more investment in what is the current reality for students rather than opining about what do I think the future reality should be for adults. And so, and again, on that one, you've gotten better faster. Like you've gotten really good at that. Also, it's helpful that I've noticed in a few meetings, I almost teared up. It's like they called each other out. So people are starting to see stuff, and you're starting to support each other as a team. That's beautiful stuff. That's beautiful stuff. So that excites me as a coach when people's like, oh, hold on. Is that a technical question? Or wait a minute, that sounds like a recommendation to the superintendent. That doesn't sound like actual inquiry about what's going on for students. That sounds like a low-key recommendation. And so hearing each other call each other out, I think that's why you've grown faster on there. So I think your sharper edge for growth is in preparation, but that's the other area we've still got some area to grow is, are we focused on what is the reality for students, and strategically what is she doing in response to that reality, as opposed to showing up and saying, I've got a bunch of ideas, maybe you should implement these things. And so those are the two big areas for growth in terms of moving from kind of moderately effective or full-blown ineffective monitoring into the realm of effective monitoring. Other questions about monitoring and accountability. There's a lot of stuff on here. Obviously, we've been talking about the monitoring aspect of it. Any other questions about monitoring and accountability? A lot of different expectations on this page. Yeah.
Seems to me that, especially for this page, that we've simply not been at it long enough to develop some of these things.
Yeah. It takes some repetition.
Yeah, that we're just new and we're not, when I saw that we've done this per year, well, obviously, we haven't done this more than a few months.
Yeah, right. And as you all do this more, ideally, you'll continue to grow at that. But that's part of why it's important for you all to self-evaluate, to constantly look at what's the quality of our monitoring, and constantly look at what percentage of our time are we actually investing in monitoring. Because the last thing you want to do is plateau and this be as good as your children ever get from you. And it's really easy to plateau. You just take your eye off the continuous improvement prize. But as long as you keep your eye on the prize of continuous improvement, hey, 13% of our time was focused on monitoring. This past quarter, can we get to 25% over the next quarter? Maybe we won't be at 50% next quarter, but can we at least, what do we have to change about our agenda to get to 25%? And hey, I noticed we consistently were ineffective in this area of monitoring. What do we need to change, to move to approaching effective, or actually on full blown onto effective, or even in some areas, what do we do to move to being highly effective? And again, this is a team sport. Like, you are relying on your 7 colleagues, your board members plus your chief executive when it comes to instruction. You're relying on your 7 colleagues because they got to do their part as well. Like, if she shows up with a super weak monitoring report, it makes it really hard for y'all to be successful. Fortunately, her team's kind of throwing down the gauntlet. They are working really hard to make sure that you are the weak link and that they are not the weak link. And so I would recommend that you challenge, meet the challenge. That is a fun game to play of who could be the weaker link, the board or management. And right now, management is winning, but I encourage you to outperform them in that particular game.
But I think in fairness, as Board Member Brown mentioned, this is something we're still learning.
Yeah.
And so I think, I wouldn't say our board is a weak link. I think we're learning and we're growing in the journey and the process. And so as we learn and really get more intentional about being effective in this process, I think we'll see more of a cohesiveness in that part of it. But I don't like the idea of us against them, because that's not what this is about. I think this is about collaboration. And as you mentioned, we have to set the tone from the top up. So if it becomes a us versus them, then that's the opposite.
No, that's absolutely fair. No, I was being facetious, but part of what I was trying to point out, when we actually started this, the monitoring reports were particularly weak. And that is no longer the case, is really the bigger point I was trying to make. And this actually, before you showed up, I actually had some amount of concern around the weakness of, when we initially got started out. But the management, they did not stay there long. They's like, nah, that's not going to be us. And they have thrown the gauntlet down and said, no, we're going to be exemplars in this work. And so they've gotten better faster. I would simply encourage the board to follow suit. But yeah, it is a team sport. Like, it's really hard for a superintendent to outperform a board. But at the same time, it's kind of hard for a board to outperform a superintendent. And so you both, iron has to sharpen iron on this thing. Did you have your hand up, Dr. Pierce? Okay, sorry, I thought you had your hand up. Yeah, Carol?
I'm sorry to keep asking questions, but I am wrestling with this, and actually Russ and I have gone back and forth a little bit with. Aren't the who, what, and why questions largely tactical? Like, I'm struggling a bit with a who, what, or why question that couldn't be asked ahead of time and answered ahead of time.
Yeah, so you can ask all of your questions about monitoring reports ahead of time, and that's perfectly fine. All of your technical, all of your tactical, all your strategic, you can ask all that ahead of time. That's perfectly fine. Just in the same way that when you receive information about your agenda, your board items that you're going to vote on, I'd recommend that you submit all your questions for those ahead of time as well. But the difference is, when you submit questions in advance for business items that you're going to vote on, the benefit of submitting them in advance is that you save time, that you're not having to go over the exact same discussions as a full body. You've all seen the questions, you've all seen the answers, it's a public document, it's fully transparent, and so now you can focus your energy elsewhere. When you submit questions in advance on monitoring reports, the benefit of that is you are just giving the staff an opportunity to be prepared with even better answers than they might have otherwise.
Like questions again.
And you are strengthening the quality of the strategic conversation that you're having. The point of submitting strategic questions about monitoring in advance isn't to save time. You'd still ask those same questions, but the point is that you'd be pulling it into the conversation for the full board to have that strategic conversation.
So can you give me an example of like a who question that would be tactical versus a who question that would be strategic?
So the reason that you're asking questions about kind of who is this data applying to is what you're really trying to understand is before we get into what is the strategic response, trying to understand what is the problem we're solving for.
Right.
That's the purpose of those questions, is you are trying to make sure that you all, as a governing body, that you understand the reality for your students so thoroughly that if the superintendent came back with a strategy that wasn't actually responsive to the reality for students, you'd immediately recognize it. So if you all say, okay, so we're seeing this data, our students aren't quite where they want to be, like who among our students, seem to be struggling the most? And he's like, well, the students who are struggling the most are students, with 10 or more absences. Like that seems to have the strongest correlation with struggle, and we think if we can cure those 10 or more absences, then that's going to make a difference. Great, so now we have an idea of kind of who it is. And so then when she starts talking about strategy, well, what we're going to do is for the students who are, in attendance, we're going to get them some more, get them some more tutoring. Well, on the surface, that sounds interesting, but it doesn't actually match up with what she just told you earlier, is that it's these kids who aren't there is the challenge. Not we need more tutoring for the kids who are there. It's what about the kids who are missing? And so you need to understand the reality for students so thoroughly that when you do get to the strategy about what are we going to do about that reality, that you'll immediately be able to sniff out what makes sense as a strategy and what doesn't really pass the sniff test. And so to your point, you're correct. That when you are trying to understand the current data set, that sometimes that's going to feel it's going to feel kind of tactical. But the purpose of understanding the data is to prepare you to have a more meaningful strategic conversation. That is the whole point of having that conversation.
So just asking, what demographic is struggling the most, or what, really is why are you asking?
Right, but other who questions, that are lean much more toward the strategic is, okay, so it sounded like students were struggling in this particular area, and I heard you say you deployed this particular strategy. Who did that intervention work for? And now we're a little bit more clearly in the realm of trying to understand what was the effect of the strategy that was deployed. Again, this has us looking backwards to get clarity about what has happened, so that way, the more clarity I have about what's happened, what's worked, what hasn't worked, who's it worked for, who's it not worked for, the more clarity I have about where we are and how we got here, the more open-eyed I can be about identifying, does the strategy for what will happen next make any sense? That's also why you spend a lot more time in monitoring, getting clarity about where are we and how did we get here, what's worked and what hasn't worked, and who's it worked for, who's it not worked. You're spending a lot more time on that, because what we're going to do next, in the absence of being clear about that, you have no idea if what we're going to do next makes any sense. You have no idea whatsoever. Well, that sounds good. I read on Facebook that people want to see us spend more time on math. Okay, great. But if you don't actually know where we are, and importantly, how we got here and what we've tried and what's worked and what hasn't, and all those things, then you don't know if us spending more time on math is actually a strategy that makes any sense. And importantly, you don't know if she knows that it does or doesn't make sense. This is your opportunity to get clear about that. But your access to that is, first you have to be clear about where are we and where are our students right now and how do they get here. And then in the context of that, when she starts describing, and here's how I respond to that data, then you have some more insight into, yeah, okay, I see how what you're doing next is responsive to where we are and how we got here. Or what you're doing next, I don't see the connection with where we are or how we got here. And that's when you're having some of your most powerful strategic conversations, because you're really drilling into, does our executive have a clear-eyed vision of what needs to happen strategically in this district and what the strategic deployment of resources is? It's really important to get clear on these matters. So I appreciate the inquiry. Other questions about this page of the instrument, monitoring and accountability. Other questions about the topics of monitoring and accountability?
Can we go back? Can I try to re-say it back to you just
Yeah.
So in looking at Carol's question about, just saying a who question seems like it would be a technical or tactical, but it really comes back to the understanding of why the question is being asked. So if you are asking a question because you don't understand how a program works or how it's implemented on the ground, that is a technical or tactical question. If you're asking a question because you're trying to test and understand the strategy, then that is a strategic question. So it doesn't just hone on the beginning word of the question. Am I saying that right?
It doesn't matter whether it's a what, it's really a why you're asking it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I can ask a who question, that's not a who question. So superintendent, who are you going to make sure gets this other intervention that I think is important? That is not a who question. That is not testing, what, which students have or haven't benefited from it. That is clearly a future-facing recommendation, not a past-facing, inquiry into what's working and not working for our students. So yeah, you can use the words. That is not the point. You have to be savvy enough. And by the way, you all do this actually as well as anybody, particularly as chair. You do this as well as anybody that I've seen. That you've really gotten better at catching. Because I'll be watching your board meetings, and I'll be thinking to myself, yeah, that was not actually a who question. That was a recommendation masquerading as a who question. Looking at you, Eric. At the last one, you asked one, and then the board chair, and I was thinking, and then the board chair immediately caught it. It's like, well, hold on, that sounds like a recommendation. And then you're like, oh, yeah. And then you all kind of calibrated, you talked a little bit about it. Here's one of the things I really appreciate that you all do as well, is that in every single question you ask, even if it's not quite spot on at the moment, I feel like you all do a good job of helping kind of refine the question. Okay, so what is, there is an important question here. Let's help each other get to it. And I see you all do that. A lot of boards don't do that well. They do not play well in the sandbox together. And that is something that you all actually do quite well, is that even if there's a question like that's not quite on point with where we're trying to be, but there is an underlying, important kernel, and you all do a good job of helping each other refine the question and get at it. And that's what I saw happen, one of your most recent monitoring. And so, yes, just because we use the correct language doesn't make it a question that's actually successful or trying to accomplish. But this, again, that's legitimately an area where you all do well at, is that you don't just cut off people and say, don't ask the question. It's like, well, hold on, let's get at what is the question, that you're really trying to get at, and let's help you get there. Because that is going to help you get better faster than just cutting things off entirely. Anything else about monitoring and accountability?
I wouldn't mind having a conversation, because I think this has come up a bit. On the yellow, at the last criteria, it says the superintendent is evaluated only on performance regarding the board's goals, guardrails, and interim goals and guardrails. The board considers the superintendent performance to be indistinguishable from school system performance. And I think that as a board, we might have a difference of opinion about whether that is an appropriate, whether we should have competencies, what the format, and it might be worth talking about with AJ here.
I think we are next, aren't we?
We are having that exact conversation. That is exactly the next conversation we're
Oh,
having.
the next topic.
It's about superintendent evaluation.
Okay, so I'm getting ahead of this.
And by the way, you just totally stole my thunder, because that's exactly the topic that we're going to start with, is what should be the basis of superintendent evaluation. So be thinking about that, because we will come back to this exact conversation. What should be the basis of superintendent evaluation and why? We'll be coming back to that. So be thinking about that. Our suggestion to you is that to be student outcomes focused, there is definitely and demonstrably and clearly better answers and worse answers to that question. And so what it really comes down to is how student outcomes focused are we interested in being. But hold on to that, because we will come back to that in the next piece. Anything else about monitoring and accountability? Yeah, after we talk about board self-evaluation, what we're doing now, we will then be talking about superintendent evaluation. Anything else about monitoring and accountability? Any other indicators on here that jumped out at folks that you were curious about? And as is always with everything in this instrument, if you ever have curiosity about something and you're wondering, where can I read more in the literature about something, just ask, and I'm happy to point you in the direction of stuff if you want to get really read up on various topics.
Okay, I have one more.
Yeah.
In blue, well, there's two actually, but the third one down says the school system has achieved at least half of its interim goals during the previous 12-month period. So in addition to getting all of this up and running and structured and doing it according to this framework
If you're doing all those doings
and it's not working.
and it's not working, that is not masterful. What that usually means is either we're not implementing on the managerial side, or we aren't effectively calibrated in our interim metrics, which is something that you want to catch sooner rather than later. And I've seen both. And honestly, it's that second one a lot of the time that we're finding there's very little actual predictive quality between our interim metrics and our summative metrics. That is a very common phenomenon. In fact, when I was with the state agency in Texas, and we were doing this work, so many districts wound up using interim goals that had no relationship to their summative goals, that as a state agency, we actually built out a free interim assessment that districts could opt in to use if they wanted to, that was explicitly aligned to the state summative, just because so many people were struggling with that. And then a lot of your smaller districts didn't have any psychometricians in them. Psychometrician, fancy term for test nerd. So they didn't have any psychometricians, and so they were struggling to figure out how to get these things to add up. And so we actually, as an agency, made the investment to develop a set of interim assessments that were explicitly aligned to the summative assessment that they could use for interim goals if they wanted to. And a lot of districts ultimately adopted that because it was clearly aligned and gave them more valuable information and insights on how to serve their kids. But yeah, a lot of districts get into this work and say, oh, we're doing the monitoring, and yeah, the interims look great, and at the end of the year, the summative, is horrible. Well, that's usually an alignment issue. That's the biggest thing that particular indicator normally catches, is that we have alignment issues between our interim assessments and our summative assessments. Anything else on monitoring and accountability?
I have one just before
Yeah.
we move forward. One of actually, appreciation on our part in the blue section. If the board approves an annual budget, it does so only after determining that the board's goals are the first priority
Yes.
for the resource allocation. So this is a practice that even prior to adopting SOFG, we've been, very, very vehement and focused on. So I appreciate this, as a part of our continuing work and behavior.
Yeah, the coaching that we offer is if the superintendent has not convinced you that accomplishment of the goals is the first priority for resource allocation, our coaching is do not adopt that agenda. And so what it's going to take is, your direct reports are going to have to bump their heads and figure out, okay, what does it look like for the goals to be the top priority for resource allocation? And because you've got finance on one side of the table and academics on the other side of the table, y'all gonna have to sync up and figure out how to make sure that that's the case. Now, I've had enough interactions with your CFO that I don't suspect that that's going to be a huge drama point, but it is non-negotiable. Like, if your management team comes back and they have not convinced you that the goals were the top priority for resource allocation, then our coaching is to absolutely send it back. And further, our coaching is to come in by default not convinced. That is actually our coaching. This is one of the few times we say come in and show up full on skeptical. And it's their task collectively to convince you that actually, no, here's why we say that the goals that you've adopted, the vision of this community that you've codified in the goals, here's the evidence that we have made sure that's the first priority. And it's their job to convince you. And if you're not convinced, my recommendation is actually do not vote in favor of that budget. And so that is a pretty high bar that we recommend the board set. But it's because, you got to put your money where your community's vision is. You got to be willing to do that, even when it's hard, even when it's unpopular with other adults, whether in the community or adults within the school system, even when it means reallocating resources in ways that are uncomfortable. You've got to be willing to put your money, where your vision is. And if you're not willing to do that, don't try to hold the claim that we're focused on student outcomes. This is a really hard expectation to have, but but it's absolutely essential. And so, yeah, I appreciate you surfacing that. And I've seen different management teams across the country accomplish this in different ways, so there's no one way it looks. But they should go into every budgetary period saying, okay, we're not getting out of this thing alive until we've convinced ideally 7 elected officials that the goals that they set on behalf of this community is the first priority for resource allocation. If you're not convinced, don't vote yes. Any other questions or reflections on monitoring and accountability? Really important one. And that's also why that's on the master's focus. That is a very high standard. There's a reason that's not all the way to the left. It is all the way to the right for a reason. Anything else on monitoring and accountability before we transition? So I wasn't clear. Where was the consensus on this one? How did you self-evaluate? I heard people kind of give 3 different answers, so I'm curious about, where's your consensus? Where is the current level of board performance?
I say, for me, yellow.
Approaching? All right.
Yellow.
Got it. Thank you, Ramona. All right, so for monitoring accountability, approaching focus. Got it. Then that takes us to communication and collaboration. The board will lead transparently and include stakeholders in the pursuit of the goals. Go ahead and read communication and collaboration, and go ahead and self-evaluate where is the board on this particular competency. Communication, collaboration. What say you? Where is the board on communication and collaboration?
I saw a bit of lime green. I think that we're well into approaching and well into practicing a great deal of what is listed here. On the green side, we're meeting several of the criteria there. No more than 4 board authorized public meetings. We typically fall within 3. Board schedules no more than 5 topics. We pretty much keep to that consistently. We have executive reports that are offered. We have board matters that we'll discuss. And then we have that section, of course, of consent agenda that is, fairly not even fairly, thoroughly addressed. So I think just on a categorical standpoint, in terms of how you look at our agenda, it's pretty comprehensive, and I'd say under 5 points, or at least 5, or at best 5, excuse me. So I see us, very strongly in the approaching aspect, but I think that we meet several criteria, in the green.
Got it. What else? What are you thinking? Yeah, Eric?
Yeah, I think we're doing pretty well in the yellow category. we're starting to work on some things in the green, but I don't think we've gotten very far. And we've got a ways to go. I have noticed as soon as I started reading, this time I started in the blue, and that first one just really hit me. Wow.
Yeah. There are some challenging things here. Absolutely. Yeah, Carol?
By board authorized meetings, we don't just mean full board, we mean committees too, right?
Yeah, all the different meetings authorized by the board, yeah.
And then the other thing is that I think we've spent one meeting publicly kind of going over time use evaluation. And then my question is, are we supposed to do that publicly, or once we have that automatized or systematized, can't we just kind of keep track of that on the side, or we're supposed to do that
Yeah,
publicly?
I enjoy it when boards include it as part of the minutes.
Okay, and that's
Then there's
public
an easy
enough?
place to look back and see, oh yeah, this is how we invested our time. Was it focused on goal setting, goal monitoring, guardrail setting, guardrail monitoring, leadership evaluation, voting, community engagement? Like how did we spend our time? And yeah, I find that that is
misread
helpful.
that. I was thinking we had to publicly do the tracking, but it's public meetings. Never
Yeah.
mind, I misread it wrong.
The other thing to note there is that what you're trying to track is how did the board spend its time over a month? So whether you had one meeting during the month or 20 meetings during the month, you're tracking the totality of that. So if you spent 1,000 minutes this month, it doesn't matter if that was in one meeting or 12 meetings. You're still, doing a time use evaluation of the 1,000 minutes. And ideally, if you're spending 1,000 minutes together, in board authorized meetings, ideally 500 of those minutes at least are being invested in monitoring progress relative to your goals for student outcomes.
So once we get that sort of systematized, just issuing it as part of the agenda,
As part of the minutes, like in the consent,
or the
Part of the
minutes.
vote on it. as
Consent,
part of the
sorry.
minutes.
Thank you.
Yeah, we wouldn't talk about it.
Yeah, no, I definitely recommend it's in minutes, and unless you have some legal reason otherwise, I'd recommend that minutes just go on consent agenda. Other questions or comments about communication collaboration? Anybody else? Where would you put yourself? So far, I'm hearing approaching. Anybody else?
I would say we are also at approaching. I think some of these areas defined here, we are making a lot of progress in, but there are some areas here that I think we are still trying to figure out, like a cohesiveness of how we're going to go about it. But I feel like we definitely are in this yellow approaching category.
Yeah. What comes up for most boards here is the boards want to do all the things. That's what it really comes down to. Is boards just really want to do all the things. And what this is suggesting is you can do some of the things really well, you can do all the things poorly. But you can't do all the things really, really well. And that you'd have to prioritize. And part of the reason is because you all have made the mistake of having humans on your school board. Like if you got rid of that aspect, you'd be okay. But the problem is humans have certain limitations. One of those limitations, in the literature suggests that deliberative bodies, so bodies that are actually deliberating for the purpose of making a decision, that they really tend to grow in effectiveness in the quality of their deliberation, the quality of their corresponding decisions, tends to kind of grow as the body gets into the work over the first 90 minutes, and just it gets stronger and stronger as we have more generative dialogue. The first 90 minutes, the dialogue gets stronger and stronger. And any guesses what happens in 90 minutes? Nope. It plateaus.
Oh.
And then it stays plateaued for about another half an hour, and then guess what happens?
Oh.
And then it starts to nosedive. It's the practical way I think of this is ask yourself, what decisions have you made in life that you are super proud of after midnight? Like realistically, like if we're having board meetings, and we're making key decisions at 1 o'clock in the morning, this is probably not the best you can do. Like if you ever been in the meeting and is like, I can barely think straight right now. Let's just hurry up and vote on these $20 million. Think that through, folks. That's suboptimal. But that's not because you're suboptimal humans. It's because humans have, physiology that only goes so far. And so the better strategy is how much cognitive work can we offload to before a meeting? Hence why we encourage so many questions and, and getting those answers before meetings so you have time to really do a lot of cognition in advance, such that we get to the meeting, we're digging into the key strategic points, and then we're moving to a decision quickly. If we're spending all of our time on technical and tactical stuff at the board meeting, that's really what starts to drag a decision out for 12 hours if we're all asking super basic questions. But then by the time you get to the end of all of that, you've cognitively spent yourselves, and so you're not really in a place to do your best thinking. At that point, I hesitate to say this because it's horrible too. At that point, you'd be better off saying, let's adjourn this and let's actually make the decision the next meeting we've had a chance to sleep on it. But making a decision on an item that we've been talking about for 5 hours is not a recipe for greatness. It's one of the functions of being human. Yeah, Michael?
I've struggled a little bit with this question around community engagement.
Yeah.
And, how we behaviorally are integrating that into, our board meeting. The way that we have typically behaved is that we listen to someone come to us from the community, they provide their issue or their topic points, and then we say, God bless you, good night.
Get out, yeah.
Well, we don't say get out.
But that's how it often feels.
But yes, yes.
Even when that's not our intention as a board, that's how it often feels. And part of the reason I say that, because that was actually my very first school board meeting, was I was showing up because my kid wasn't getting what my kid deserved at his school. And after taking up with the teacher and then taking up with the principal and trying to go through all the rounds, finally I got so frustrated, I showed up to a board meeting. I said, look, my kid's not getting what he deserves. My kid's got me advocating for him. The rest of these kids, I don't see anybody showing up advocating for them. I'm advocating for all my kids' friends, but this is not a sustainable system. School board, what are you going to do about it? And guess what they all said?
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a good night. All right, the next speaker will be, and what I experienced was, get out. So even if that's not what you meant, that's I suspect I'm not alone, and that's the experience. So the resolution to that is to recognize that that is not a form of community engagement. Public
Correct.
Comments are not a form of authentic two-way engagement with our stakeholders around the vision and values of the community. It simply is not. And so that's not a rally against public comments. I suspect, like in a lot of states, public comments, probably there's some legal requirement around public comments. And so, there's not? Okay, well, even if there's not, people do public comments, so be it. But don't mistake public comments as an authentic two-way back and forth dialogue with your community around the vision and values of your community. Like you just need to schedule separate time explicitly to do that so that you actually can have this generative dialogue with folks in your community about their vision and values. And so not opposed to public comments. Just understand on your time use evaluation, those are never going to get tracked as community engagement minutes because they are not. Those will always be tracked as other, because that's what they are. They're something other than community engagement.
So even in the instance of, in previous boards, we would practice clarifying questions. If there were, something that was brought to us, we would ask a clarifying question in alignment to, and then direct them to the administration. I know that we have avoided doing that as of recent because most of the reasons folks come before us anyway
Have nothing to do with the board.
have nothing to do with, what we're here to do.
Yeah.
It's actually
There's really hard.
absolutely, administratively relative. So how do we then look at this opportunity? I mean, otherwise now we're scheduling, another board meeting exactly. I mean, is this something that we could look at doing maybe on a quarterly basis, something to that effect in terms of integrating
So
these
example, for
opportunities?
my school board, that's essentially what we do is we have regularly scheduled time for community engagement. That's completely separate and apart. It's an entirely separate meeting. It's not every month, and so, it's on our calendar that, these times each year we're going to have community engagement conversations, and it's going to be an opportunity where we're going to present around the goals and the guardrails and kind of what's worked and what hasn't. And we'll be presenting on that to our community. It won't be the staff presenting. It'll be us because, we're the community's representatives. They deserve to hear from us. Okay, since the last time we came together, here's what the goals are and here's where here's what's worked, here's what hasn't, and here's what the administration is doing about it. And then we open it up for questions and comments about the vision and values of the community, and people can bring whatever they want, and then we can have that conversation. And a lot of the time, it's exactly what you said. It's actually not our work; it's superintendent's work. And so it's like, hey, well, let's connect you with her. She's her and her team can take care of this, and then you grab the appropriate person, and they take that person off, and they talk about it. But then when people do bring up issues that actually are about the board's work, then yeah, we have a conversation about it. Have a back and forth conversation. We really try to understand kind of what are the underlying values and the underlying points of vision inherent in what they're talking about, and what in our policy framework they have missed the mark or not. Oh yeah, we don't really have a guardrail around that specifically. Our guardrail is around this, but not really that. Then we have should we change our guardrail? Is it still the right guardrail or not? I mean, and so we really dig into it. But that's an entirely separate meeting that happens at regular, non-monthly intervals that is specifically designed to be about engagement, two-way engagement with our community. Other questions about communication and collaboration? Sounds like there's an emerging consensus around approaching focus. Other questions about any of the other indicators on communication and collaboration?
I asked one about, in the green, the one about policies.
Yeah.
Required by law, that's kind of obvious. It's one that you can't delegate. Or maybe it's not that obvious, but my understanding is that it means you can't delegate it. But the second one, an appropriate exercise of the board's oversight authority as defined by the board's goals or guardrails. That seems to be suggesting that you're only supposed to have policies that are implementing the goals and the guardrails.
No, so we would say that board policy should only be about board work. And there are 3 defining characteristics of board work. Is it legally required of the board? Not legally required of the district, which is actually what describes a large chunk of your policies. Those are not actually legally required by the district. Many of them, by the board, many of them are simply legally required by the district.
Can you just give an example of some of those?
One of my favorite ones to use, comes from Texas, where I live, is at some point the state legislature had actually adopted a law that said the school board shall install the accounting software. Yeah, right? So can you imagine, Christina getting elected, and then 2 days later grabbing a copy of QuickBooks and heading on over to Stan's office like, hey, buddy, we're ready to get this thing going. Like, that is a scary idea. That is a really, no knock on Christina, but I would not want that happening. Like, that's a horrible, horrible plan. In that situation, the state law actually said the board shall do something. That's not what they actually meant.
Thank you.
That law has actually been erased from the books, but it's emblematic of a lot of things. There's a lot of things in state law that says the board shall, but there's a lot of things in the law that actually say the district shall. And what we're suggesting is if it does in fact say the board shall, then the board shall do it because you're legally required by the board, particularly if it's something that's non-delegable. But a lot of things in state law generally say the district shall, in which case that is clearly delegable to your management. And so our recommendation is that you wind up having these 2 layers of policy. You have the district regulations. What do you all call them? Administrative regulations?
Guidelines. No,
Guidelines, administrative guidelines.
Administrative guidelines. So you wind up having administrative guidelines, which is everything that the law says that the district has to have, and board policy, which is just the things that are directly related to the goals, directly related to the guardrails, or absolutely required of the board by state law. And so in my last district, when we went through this exercise, our board policy manual overnight in one vote went from a little over 1,000 pages to like 20 pages. In my current district, we're actually going through this policy diet process right now, and it's going to be a significant haircut. And all of that, in Texas, we refer to them as regs. So is it in policy or is it in reg? And so basically a whole bunch of things are in policy. We're just going to do one big vote, and all those things will be reclassified as regs, which means now they belong to, in our case, the superintendent rather than to the board. So now the superintendent can monitor them, can monitor and adjust them, as needed for the organization. So that's what that looks like. It's saying which policies are directly related to the goals, directly related to the guardrails, or explicitly required by law of the board to have. And if it matches one of those three criteria, then it stays in board policy. Otherwise, it goes into administrative guidelines. What's important is, why would a board behave this way? Why would a board move into administrative guidelines, things that don't directly relate to goals, guardrails, or legal requirements? Why would a board do that? Anybody? Why would a board do that?
I think it helps more define the line between board work and administrative work and helps us stay focused on governance opposed to the day-to-day operations of the district.
Basically everything that we're ever going to talk about is either directly focused on monitoring progress relative to your goals for student outcomes, or directly modifying governance systems to free up time to directly focus on monitoring progress relative to your goals for student outcomes. Like, we're either directly drilling into what is it students know and are able to do and how are we responding to that, or we're figuring out how do we cause all of our other governance systems to bend in the direction of that. And this is one of the latter. This is saying, you know what? Everything that we have on our plate that isn't the main thing is diluting our focus from the main thing. That is what the message here is. Is that if we actually want to be focused, because notice the key word here is either we're mastering a focus, we're meeting a focus, we're approaching focus, or we're not focused. The operative term here is focused. And so the idea is everything that we take responsibility for that isn't what we say are the things that matter most is something that dilutes our focus, on what we're trying to accomplish. And so that is the intention there. Yeah, Carol?
How do you, it feels, though, sometimes, that by narrowing the board policies to such a degree, we're abdicating responsibility for things. And how do you kind of reconcile
Yeah.
that? Like we've spent a lot of time talking about equity policy. We spent a lot of time, some other policies that we've talked about, and and over the years. And at what point, how do we figure out, why should we feel comfortable that it's okay if we hand all of that off?
Yeah. Well, so the first thing to be clear about is you're only handing off the things that you didn't already say were a priority for you to be focused on. So all the things that are directly related to your goals and guardrails, you're keeping that because you've said these are the things that we say are most important and that we want to focus on.
So, quick question. So we have, a lot of our guardrails are equity-based. So we would hold on to the equity policy because that's directly related to goals and guardrails.
Yeah, as long as it's
Why did you think we weren't?
Why did I think we weren't?
Yeah.
Because I thought that, that's what I'm trying to figure out.
And so that's the thing, is you're going to have to look at them and figure out which of these are actually directly related to our goals, directly related to our guardrails. Those stay. Everything else goes. Now, only things that are direct related. So if you have a policy...
like what's directly related?
Well, if it literally shows up in the language of the goals, the guardrails, the interim goals, the interim guardrails, then that makes sense for you to keep it. If it does not literally show up in the language of those. So, for example, you might say,
Transgender,
if we...
gender variant.
If we use, these vendors instead of those vendors, that's, directly related, to, equity. I don't think you have anything about that in the language of your guardrails or interim guardrails. So that sounds like it is, in fact, indirectly related. So I'm not suggesting it's not related. It's just, it does not literally show up in the language of your guardrails or interim guardrails. And so that is the challenge, is that those are the things that you all have said are the highest priority for this board to be focused on. And so what matters is when push comes to shove is, were we sincerely meaning that these are the highest priority, which means if they actually are, then we're going to have to make the sacrifice. Like, that means we can't be focused on everything and be focused on the priorities. And that is a challenge in this approach to governing, is that we're saying it is so critical that these things get done and that they get done well, that we're going to focus on making sure that happens for the period that we've delineated, usually 3 to 5 years. We're going to focus the next 3 to 5 years on this thing happening, because if this thing gets done, it's going to have this net positive effect ripple out throughout our organization. And if this thing doesn't get done, it's going to have this net unacceptable, net negative thing happen ripple through the organization. So we're going to focus here, even when the focusing here is at the cost of focusing on other things that other people would like us to focus on, or stuff that we'd like to focus on. But that is the nature of focus. If you focus on everything, you've actually focused on nothing. And so what this is describing is, we are going to say that we're going to focus on some things. But focus, by definition, means that the only way you achieve focus is that you have to be willing to let other things go. And so the question at that point becomes, are the things that we've identified as being the focus, are they so important that we're going to let other things go? Or are they, in fact, not as important as we say, in which case we are going to go and get involved in all these other things? And it's not like one answer is right and one is wrong. You just need to be clear about what the cost is. If you are not willing to focus, what you are literally saying is these things are not so important that we need to forego other things to make sure they get done. And so that's why selecting your guardrails is particularly important. Eric, did I see your head up? And then we'll come back over to Michael.
Yes. I don't want to make an assumption, but what I think I'm hearing also is that the large numbers of policies that we have that are simply recitations of law would all go. I'm not talking about legally required policy, but they're merely recitations of law. And the reason they're there, I think, is that the policy book is almost a one-stop shop for the public, for people that deal with us, and that they can look up the rules in dealing with us, whether they're prescribed by law, but they can find them all in the policy book.
Yeah, and ideally, it is very easy for your staff to know where do we need to look, for stuff. And like I said, my last district was pretty easy because the board policy manual turned into about 20 pages. So you can, nope, it's not in here. It must be, in the administrative regulations manual. And so that was not a challenge. If you wind up with a board policy manual that's 1,000 pages and administrative regulations manual that's 1,000 pages, you've already made it hard for your staff. So in part, what we're trying to do is figure out how do we make it easier. But yeah, this is the challenge. Michael and then Jennifer.
Oh, sorry.
But let me just follow up. So that if somebody is looking for an answer, looks to the board policy and it's not there, turns to the regulations or guidelines and it's not there, then what they'll need to do is look to the Ohio Revised Code or Department of Education regulations.
Well, and realistically, like I said, in my examples, when we've gone through this policy diet process, none of that stuff disappeared. In my case, it's always just showed up in administrative guidelines, and so they still didn't have to go to state statute. They just looked at the administrative guidelines because they knew that was the compendium of all the stuff. Yeah.
We tend to, I kind of see that almost as reverse engineering. We tend to look at it from the overarching matter of, and I'm going to use that word matter.
Yeah.
We're looking at it from the overarching matter of this is the policy, and then we identify administrative guideline as the superintendent may or shall.
Yeah.
And that's pretty much how we cite that in our policy. When you were talking about energy, and I saw it very clearly. I don't think that one negates the other. I don't think that energy negates matter. I think matter is an instance of necessity. I think matter is an instance of how we define ourselves in a very stable kind of way with our overarching policy. So, for example, an equity policy to me is a matter. It is something that is absolutely needed and important, albeit we may not have our strategic focus on equity, so to speak, as we do in our currently defined goals, and we have defined equity as a part of that.
You have.
But if that weren't the case, it doesn't negate an equity policy being in place, if I'm making any sense. So energy is one thing, matter is another. I think the energy is how we make matter work and happen. I'm speaking from a nerdy kind of scientific kind of way. I'm pushing, I'm using a force and energy to move this, but at the same time, this needs to be here. And I see that relationship between how we focus our efforts and our energy and where we choose to do that, I see that as symbiotic. I see that as something that works together, if I'm making any sense. To me, they don't negate each other. Our energies and our efforts will be something that it is, but at the same time, it does not negate the need for a particular policy or something in place to identify what our vision and our values are. Am I making sense?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, I think the only thing we're debating is, so who does that? And what we're saying is things that you all have identified as priorities, you do that. Things that you have not identified as priorities, you're saying y'all do that. And so I completely agree, with what you're laying down. Now the only question is, so if the next matter shows up, my coaching to you all would be, is this directly related to our goals or guardrails? No, it's not. Excellent. Which one of these three astute individuals is now responsible for this? And not because we don't think it's worth being attended to. We obviously do, because we're making sure that the appropriate staff members attending to it. But because we know that every single thing that the 7 of us talk about is going to inspire some type of focus on the part of the administration. And if the things that we're talking about are different than the things we've told them are a priority, then they are going to take time away from the things that they were going to do that were focusing on priority.
Opportunity costs, I got you.
There's an opportunity cost to everything. And so, if the superintendent has 10 units of energy to spend each week, if we're constantly talking about goals and guardrails, then all 10 units of energy get spent on that. The second we show up and say, oh, and by the way, we also need to make sure that the buses are all painted purple. Because I saw on Twitter that purple buses, help kids read better. Now all of a sudden, of our 10 units of energy, at least one of them is now focused on purple buses, which means less energy that is being focused on, are we accomplishing the goals and the guardrails? I would hope that purple bus thing is really going to work out, and that's going to be the difference. That's all the kids can magically read now that the bus is purple. I hope that that's how impactful it is, because it is definitely, because if it's not, it is definitely just cost children access.
But hold on, because I have a clarifying question to that effect, which I wanted to go into.
Yeah.
Because I do realize that there's such a heavy focus on the whole student outcomes focused governance aspect of it, but not in a almost laissez-faire focus on operations.
On the guardrails. Because the guardrails are really focused at your operations.
Okay. What about things that do sidetrack us? And like many other districts throughout the country, where we're dealing with a situation of, okay, there's a connection between inputs. So if something disrupts an input, something that disrupts an input, like not enough, like student violence, or something that distracts or disrupts an input, like bus drivers and need for that. These are things that we have to consider and with the superintendent to bring some resolve or resources to bear. What about instances of those?
So it depends. Is it that the board actually has anything to do? So, for example, you have a shortage of bus drivers. Mm-hmm. What exact vote does the board have to take?
Oh, it could be any number of things, AJ. It could be income. It could be any number of things. It could be,
Does she need the board to vote to raise what you're paying bus drivers from $20 an hour to $25 an hour? Does she need the board to vote for that?
yeah. Yes, sir.
Is everybody, hold on. I want to make sure, is that accurate? Does everybody, so if she's going to change what bus drivers are paid in order to bridge a gap, that has to come back to the board.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
That's a generative part of our work. Yes, sir.
Well,
Okay.
the approval of each individual person would be boarded, right? But for her to just raise it, she could do that, right?
We've increased salaries.
Right.
So we brought that to the board.
So I'm fairly confident.
All the time.
So if,
That's a matter of contract, which is why it need to come to us.
okay, so that's an example of a contract. And so it sounds like legally, then if there's a change to a contract, that has to come back to you. That makes sense to me. But if that's not a matter of a contract, say, somebody,
Booting or something.
here in this building who's not on a contract, she's having trouble finding, administrative assistants. And so she's got to go from paying $30,000 to $35,000. Does that have to come back to the board?
No, not for an instance of a specific person, no. Particularly if that person reports directly to her.
Yeah, and so,
Or come with, use an example with transportation, she decides not to transport high schoolers.
does she have the authority to make that decision?
That wouldn't be collaborative.
Yes.
No.
Yes, but I think we want to, because we know that affects a huge portion of the public, and we're going to hear all about it no matter what. We would want to do that publicly for transparency purposes.
You would want it done publicly, or you would want to do it publicly? Those are two different things.
We would want to do it publicly.
Or
And
we
what-
want her to inform us she's doing.
No, I'm asking, I'm trying to understand, if we go from transporting high schoolers to not transporting high schoolers. It sounds like legally she has the authority, she could make that call.
I'm not sure about that.
And I think we'd want her to report it to us
So,
at a board.
There-
this-
We have to file something with ODE, don't
Yeah,
we?
I don't think-
Change the transportation model.
Yeah.
All right, bad example. What's an example that?
Pick another example.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, I was like,
Yeah,
I don't think that's it.
It depends which way it's going because there's one that's good cost and one that is not.
Right,
So,
that's what I
yes.
was trying to get at.
so the short answer
Yeah.
here is, remember, there are three things that a board work. Directly related to your goals, it's directly related to your guardrails, or it's legally required. So it sounds like every example we've, surfaced so far, it met one of those three criteria, which was legally required. So in those situations, you have to do it because it would be illegal for you not to. So things that you legally have to do, you just legally have to do, and there's no way around it. You legally have to adopt a budget. I'm assuming if you all don't adopt a budget, the state's going to show up, very quickly and have some things to say about it. You have to do the things that you're legally required to do, and sometimes, unfortunately, legal requirements are going to involve a board member running down with a copy of QuickBooks trying to install it. And so that's the nature of state law.
Now, what might be a better example, that is COVID restrictions.
So there was no state
Board
statute.
never acted
Right,
on required masking and distances and all the other things that were imposed on our students with respect to CODA.
but we spent a
COVID.
lot of time on it.
And we spent time on it, but it wasn't anything that we decided. We left all those matters to our administration.
Yeah. So it sounds like it wasn't directly related to goals, wasn't directly related to guardrails, it was not legally required. And so absolutely, the coaching would be, and what are you doing on it?
It was pandemic.
Now, I understand why people want to, but all I'm suggesting is that in every moment you choose to, you are actively saying our goals and guardrails are less important. It's okay for time on those to be diluted and instead be put on these things. That's what you need to be clear about.
And you know what I'm thinking about, and I think I'm really guilty of this, is I'm thinking of the increased violence in schools and where that
wasn't goals, that wasn't guardrails, and that wasn't board required, but we've been asking Talisa to report on that and give us data and more data and not enough data and analyze the data. I mean, we've been, and you know, like where's the board responsibility there?
And again, you got to have your eyes open on this.
Yeah.
Every time you spend time on things that are not what you've defined as your priorities, directly related goals, directly related guardrails, legally required, what you were saying to the administration is that we are comfortable with you taking your eyes off of the things that we've defined as the priorities to focus on these other things that we are clearly now prioritizing. And so if
I just feel like that's a bad example too, because
Well, no, but why is it a
because
bad
if we
example?
can't get if those things continue to happen and students are not in the right mental state to learn, how do we even accomplish anything?
Is it a
So-
whole child?
yeah,
Whole
but
child?
the challenge with that is you assume that anything you've done is the difference maker.
Anything, right.
That's the assumption you're making, and I'm fairly confident that assumption will not hold. So I could show you boards that have got deeply involved in COVID and boards that ignored COVID entirely, and the operational results for both of those school systems were functionally identical. The student outcome results for those two different school systems are not. And so, of all the boards that I've supported, all the districts I supported, with COVID response, I have no evidence whatsoever that the response of the school system was meaningfully modified, by the board's involvement.
Weighing in.
And moreover, you want me to be right. Like, you don't want a responsible managerial approach to hinge on, did I remember to ask the right question in a board meeting? Like, you don't want that to be, the key thing that holds together all of your operations, because what that means is every time there's any type of issue, we don't have a staff competent enough to sort through it, and it's got to come back to us, because if we don't put our fingers on it, then it's not going to be done right. If that's the case, you may just simply have the wrong team. And so, I mean, like, I would just question, did us getting involved, was that the difference maker? Does it demonstrate something to your community? Does it communicate things to people who are watching? Does it, yeah, sure. But did it actually make a difference in the lived experience of students? I would challenge you to provide any evidence that that's the case. Yeah.
But AJ,
Yeah, Ramon.
I'm sorry, I can't really handle
Yeah, jump
it.
in.
So like when you're looking at monitoring and accountability, it says 50% of the total board authorized public meeting minutes should reflect our goals.
Yeah, you got plenty of
So
other time to do stuff.
Right. So I guess I don't see it as we're monitoring. In some way, I'm wondering how do we get informed
Right.
that safety is. I'm looking at it as informed,
Yes.
and I know that.
Yes, you are
so
spot
it's
on.
not monitoring.
You are spot on. That's exactly correct. None of what I'm suggesting is that the board shouldn't be informed about this stuff. That's not the debate. What's the only thing I'm talking about?
Sorry.
Focus of energy.
Whether we should be telling any.
Yeah, what's the board
Discussing.
focused on during its board meetings? That's the only thing we're talking about.
Okay.
100%. Everything about COVID, the board should know every dot and tittle every step of the way. As it relates to violence in schools, the board should know everything there is to know every dot of the way. And any questions you have, you need to get answers to. That's not what we're talking about. Now all we're talking about is how's the board spend its time in board meetings.
Because you don't need to get it answered at a board meeting.
You don't. If the only way you get reliable answers is at board meetings, you have bigger problems. If the only time that the superintendent can figure out how to answer a question is when we gavel in, you have much larger problems in your organization. Yes, sir.
So a couple things come to mind. One is, as Ramona just kind of really alluded to, that I've been thinking through the whole time, was balance. Understanding the balance of conversation. As you alluded to, we've got time.
Yeah, half of our
to
time is
address-
focused on, as most, that means, by definition, we have half of our time to do other stuff with. Absolutely.
The other thing that came to mind is framing. So one of the things that we pointed out to ourselves in our evaluation in an earlier category
Yeah.
was this idea of root causal analysis, root cause analysis. I think certain things like a student violence issue, like bus drivers not showing up to work, or other people not showing up to work, that impacts as an input the resources for students to reach what we've set out in interim goals to achieve and interim guardrails to achieve and goals to achieve. Could we frame those things as a part of monitoring reports that further inform us about, what root causal factors are impacting our inputs and our outputs to student outcomes?
So there's another board I'm working with right now, and they've had a recent round of student violence and actually had a couple of their students gunned down outside, not on district property, but adjacent to district property, as kids were leaving to go home. And the board, obviously rightfully, was completely devastated by this. And is trying to figure out what is our calling as a board? Like, what can we do that actually creates a meaningful blanket of safety for our students who are now clearly craving safety? Like, what is it that we as a board can do that that actually cause that? And what, if any, interaction does any of this have with our goals and guardrails? And so these are the questions that the board members call me and ask, because people like you probably, I suspect, for me, the hardest part of being chair of my school board for as long as I was I never got to have a single year on my board where I did not have to bury children. Not a single year. It never happened. And that was one of the most emotionally exhausting part of having moms come on stage during graduation to hand them their kid's diploma posthumously. Like, that is one of the most, and you just feel completely helpless. And as a board member, the question of what do we do? And especially when it was young men who spent a tremendous amount of time in my home, and having to deal with the fact that as board chair, just got killed this weekend. There's nothing I could do. Like, all of my time, all of my energy didn't prevent all of my investment. This kid has spent practically every weekend in my house for years. And he can get gunned down 2 months before graduation. He made it this far in 2 months, and like this sense of hopelessness and frustration and anguish. Like, I'm with you 100% there. Now the only question is, what happens next? What do we do about it? Like, what actually is going to make a difference? That's what the board has to wrestle with. That's what I had to wrestle with as board chair. That's what this other board that I'm coaching has had to wrestle with very recently. And you all wrestle with the same thing. The conclusion that I arrived at is that the specific instances I have absolutely no power over. There is nothing I can do around random acts of violence that wind up impacting. Like, I can't have been there at that exact moment and pushed a kid aside. So what is it that as a board I can do? And overwhelmingly, what I could do is I can change the conditions. I can change the reality for that kid. And I mean, it is challenging to say, because there are certainly random acts. I had, of the young men who spent a lot of time in my home, who I've lost to gun violence, there's definitely two categories. Ones who they were involved in things that ultimately resulted in them being shot and killed, and then Ricky, who they were aiming for somebody else. But in both cases, there's nothing as much as I blamed myself for months and years after that, there's actually nothing I could have done to be the difference maker in that exact moment. Like, I couldn't have been there, for Deshaun. I would have wanted to be, but I couldn't. But what I do recognize is that the more successful my students are academically, that I tend to find that they are less likely to be in circumstances that are going to lead to that type of tragedy. Ultimately, my belief is I have a better chance of saving lives by educating children than by trying to figure out how to police my community. Like, I do not believe I will police black children to greatness. I do believe I can educate black children to greatness. And so every drop of energy I focus on, how do we have, should we have a zero tolerance policy, and should we, incarcerate more, black children and all these other things? Every drop of energy I invest into that is energy that, whether I want to accept it or not, that I'm pulling away from, are we getting this kid educated? Because the single biggest protective factor that I've figured out that I can offer the kids in my neighborhood, and it's maybe different in your neighborhood, I don't know Columbus. The single biggest protective factor that I can offer the kids in my neighborhood, what is the quality of instruction they're receiving? And as that increases and they get a better education, that is the greatest protective hedge I can place around them, more so than all the other stuff that we can try to do. That's the conclusion I came to. You may come to a different conclusion. Whatever conclusion you come to, then great. Put your energy in that. But if your experience is anything like mine, as much as you want to, deny it, you may come to the conclusion that the best thing I can do to create a protective hedge for my children is make sure they have a education that leaves them with a whole bunch of options that I want them choosing from, rather than the quality of education that leaves them with options that I don't want them choosing. So like I said, your experience may be different than mine.
I think it is a little bit different because I think we have to have the conversation as a board to recognize what is going on in our buildings and within our parking lots. And that is impacting attendance, and that's protecting our ability to create that protective hedge, as you're saying. If our buildings are not welcoming, if they're not safe, so to say, if our students and staff don't feel like they are belonging. And I use those words not just to relate to violence, but also to just relate to the culture of a building.
Yeah.
And I agree with you and the decision you made. I don't think that the board or board members can directly help on any of that in the policing sort of way. But to make sure that we have professionals who know more than us anyway, who deal with safety, who deal with those kinds of things, involved and providing their expertise and advice and getting recommendations there, presumably to the superintendent. If something needs to come to us for purchase or of course, we play that role, but it's, it's an area where none of us are the experts. And we may not have any expertise on the staff for something like that. In our case, we do. We do have a security team and safety and security, and we can rely on them and for them to reach out if they need to for additional help. But I agree, it's not our job, and we should focus on the things that we know and the things that we're empowered to do as a school board.
At the end of the day, the work of the board, you provide an impetus that is an accelerant in the direction of whatever issue that you invest your time. My experience tells me that of all the things that I can help accelerate that's going to make the biggest difference for the safety and well-being of my children, high-quality Tier 1 instruction is by far more impactful than anything else. If my superintendent is competent, then she's going to figure out how to, improve the quality of instruction over time, and she's going to figure out how to improve the quality of safety over time. So now my only question is, are those things going to happen? It's which one do I want to invest my energy in accelerating as a board? What are we going to focus on? Because what we focus on, we're going to try to accelerate that. If I don't believe my superintendent is competent to address the safety things, then maybe the correct answer is we have the wrong, managerial. But if I believe that my superintendent is actually competent to manage the business of the district, now my question as a board is, which things do I most want to help accelerate in the district? And if the thing you most want to accelerate is safety, then spend your time on safety. The thing you most want to accelerate is health, and spend your time on health. But just understand that that comes at the cost of you investing time in accelerating the quality of instruction that students are experiencing. That's all. It's not like there's a right answer and a wrong answer. It's that every answer has a cost, and you just got to decide where are we going to invest our time, and where are we going to focus. What are we most trying to accelerate? Yeah.
And I think part of it too is, the transparency, understanding. I think it's important that, although we can't hit the accelerator on every single thing, I think it's important that there is transparency about where we're truly at instead of, because that's what makes it sometimes feel like you do have to ask, all these additional questions, or you have to hit the gas in certain instances because you don't feel informed, or you're hearing things from third parties, and then being able to hold people accountable. If you say this is what you're doing, and yet we're not able to see that from a reporting standpoint, then it makes me not trust that you're actually doing what you say you're doing.
Yeah, and I completely agree with you on the transparency part. But that's not actually the debate we're having. The only debate we're having is the best place for that to occur at a board meeting or not. So the transparency is non-negotiable. But I assure you 100%, if the only way that there is transparency in the district is if a topic is discussed at a board meeting, by definition, that means you run a non-transparent district because there's so many things that never show up in this board meeting. And so I don't think it's that you run a non-transparent district. I think that there are just other avenues for accomplishing transparency. And so now all we're debating is which items does the transparency vehicle need to be the board meeting, and which items the transparency vehicle need to be another thing. And again, you could have the board meeting be your transparency vehicle for whatever you want. Just understand that that comes at the cost of board meeting time being used to drive performance improvements on your instructional program. That's all.
Does it when we have 50% of time?
What's that 50% supposed to be used for?
Yeah.
So it's not what you said.
It is right now when you're at 13%. It absolutely is.
But when because we're still learning.
Yeah.
But I also think from looking at past agendas and past board meetings from years ago, I think we are way more focused on more important questions and work, and bring those topics to discuss, or ask the superintendent to report on those topics. And I think that even the topic of safety and the way that Dr. Pierce described it, I mean, I can see that in our guardrails, right? Those pieces to me live in part of our guardrails, making sure that we have those environments that are safe so that children can learn it and feel themselves when they come into the buildings, as well as our staff.
If the argument is that there is space for other things, then we're in agreement. If the argument is that we can be focused on everything we want to be focused on and it will not be at a cost, I'm telling you, you are definitively mistaken. And that at some point, yes, in order to maintain that balance that Michael described earlier, that Ramona, I think, brought up first, in order to maintain that balance, at some point you actually do have to be willing to say, we're not going to focus on this, not because at a board meeting, not because it's not important, but because we make the decision that we are going to stay focused on these other things.
I hear that. I just feel like you're judging the fact that we chose to talk about safety as part of the 50%.
So
as not being valuable.
So the problem is I don't know and you don't know. That's what the real problem is you don't know that and I don't know that because you chose 13% of the time to focus on our students.
Right, assume
growing.
50. Assume 50 for this conversation.
But that's the problem. That's the problem is right now we don't know what thing is it that you chose to put up against that. And so there's all the other things that fit into that 77%. And all of those things, wound up being in direct competition with focus on student outcomes, and focus on student outcomes lost out a significant period of time. Now, did it lose out against security, or did it lose out against a contract, or like I don't know, and the problem is you don't know either. And the way that you know is you get to the point where you're saying, okay, we're definitely going to invest half of our time focused on our children learning and how we're responding to that. And then we're going to make intentional decisions about what do we do with the other half of our time? What are the other things that we are going to invest our time in? But that we aren't going to allow things to just de facto cannibalize a focus on student outcomes. We're going to be intentional about, yes, we are going to focus on these other things because we have time in our budget to do so, or no, we're not going to because we don't want it to be in competition with the focus that we want our administration to have on instruction. That is the hard decision you all have to make, and I'm just saying you're not there yet, and I'm just clarifying, that is the decision you will have to make. You will never be able to You will never be able to do everything that you want to do and have half of your time be focused on student outcomes. That it is going to come at a cost of saying some things we're not going to focus on and that they're going to have to be done a different way.
So for example, if we had a board meeting where we spent 15 minutes on monitoring and an hour and a half on other, if some of that other was safety and some of that other was back and forth over the value of a particular contract, until we get to 50%, then we're going to have to decide amongst ourselves whether we're going to do safety or the value of that other
Absolutely.
contract.
And that's the policy decision for this board to have. That is the policy decision you want to be having.
But then how
We're
does
making
that-
the assumption that by us talking about something for 50% of the time, that it's resulting in these positive outcomes for our students.
That is accurate.
That's a huge assumption.
The
for
assumption
us
that
to
we're
be
making is that the board's energy actually means something. That is the assumption we're making. But that's also the assumption you're making. The whole point of this is that's the assumption you're making, is that if we spend time on safety, safety gets better. If we spend time on busing, busing gets better. That you're making the same assumption I'm making.
So the assumption that we're making, I think, is different. The assumption that we're making is it's beyond simply the monitoring report. It's let's try to determine what the root causes are that are impacting the rate at which we're seeing growth and change. So if I'm right now, and I think this question, I stopped asking questions after I submitted this one in February around our graduation rates. If we are at a 48% of our seniors on track, how is it that if we talk 50% more of the time between now and June, that's going to lead to positive outcomes for those students?
Yes.
Without us talking about attendance, without us talking about building climate and culture, without us talking about who's responsible for getting those seniors across the stage. Those are and it's not even strategic to me. Those are the common sense questions that need to be addressed by the board.
That are appropriate part of monitoring.
Yes, and it doesn't necessarily come with this, is it 50% of the time on the monitoring report? It's all encompassing.
So if you all don't spend time getting at the root cause of things in your monitoring conversations, then you could spend all the time you want on stuff, but you will never know if it's the right stuff. This is why monitoring is so crucial, is if you aren't, it's exactly what you said, if you are not getting at what have we been doing, what's worked, what hasn't worked, why didn't it work, why did it work, then you have no idea if the thing that we choose to do next is actually the thing that's going to be meaningful. Like, you have to get to that level of dialed into understanding a topic in order to know if the strategy that we're picking next is going to make any sense. And that, just realistically, it takes time to do. And you all have demonstrated that. Like, when you all have had those type of conversations, that's been really meaningful. Like, but it's taken you'll spend an hour kind of peeling back the layers of that onion. All I'm saying is, yes, that is actually a valuable use of the board's time. And that the more that the board gets crystal clear about where are we, how did we get here, what worked, what didn't work, then you're in a better position to say, okay, now based on all of that, Madam Superintendent, what are you going to do next? And then you'll be able to hear, okay, I hear how that strategy directly connects to the root cause that we've just unearthed in our monitoring conversation. But if you haven't taken the time to have that monitoring conversation, then you may hear something you like, but you don't know if it's the right thing or not. You have no way of knowing. The only way you can know is you have to do the work. And all I'm suggesting is the best way to push that work into your organization as a board is, you all have the conversation here at the board table.
And I think that's how we're doing it. I mean, it's taken us a long time, but I think we're pushing and doing that work with the safety conversation, with the conversations around attendance. Our team has brought us, I think, some good data. We're still tweaking it, but the data is coming, and by having that conversation, it's allowing us to then hone in on. I mean, even though I'm wondering why y'all went so old school with it, the too legit to quit. So it's getting us some strategies to help us improve. I mean,
I'll tell you what,
I will MC Hammer was like,
it was not us, it was get creative.
oh.
The Get Creative.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah. That was
Hammer
old
time.
school.
Right.
Okay.
But I
was
will
whack
say
back
that
then, like-
I will say that some of the questions that you asked when our next monitoring report, we're talking about, and then goes 2.1, 2, and 3, gives a deeper dive into those next graduation classes. So when you see that the next monitoring report, please take some time, dive into it, because it's really going to be more detailed, because we're talking about graduation class of the 9th grade, 10th grade, and 11th grade cohorts.
In the 12th grade,
I'm sorry. Just real quick. The monitoring report is the 9th, 10th, and 11th grade. That's the one on the 17th. Please check your Friday's report for an update on graduation. Please.
Thank you.
We have, so all this conversation has been around how does the board spend its time, and how the board spends its time matters. And what I'm asserting to you is essentially the same thing you're asserting to me. How the board spends its time does matter. You all seem to believe that. So all I'm suggesting is how you spend your time does matter, but that if the way you're spending your time isn't aligned to your priorities, and even if it's aligned to your priorities, if it isn't done in a really effective way, that it's less likely to have the impact that you intend. And so that's why we offer you some clarity around what are the priorities. Are we investing the time into our priorities that would suggest that they're actually a priority, or are we pretending they're a priority, but we're not actually prioritizing them? And when we are prioritizing them, are we doing a quality job of that, or are we not doing a quality job of that? All of that is kind of built up in this conversation that we've been having. And these are things you have to wrestle with. The bottom line is you're going to have to make choices. There are going to be sacrifices. If you choose to do all things and focus on everything, that you will focus on nothing. And the things that you say are priorities, your children will suffer in those areas for your lack of discipline and focus. And so when you do make the decision to go to things that are not what you have said are the priority, just make it open-eyed and say, you know what, this is so crucial that we need to diverge away from the priorities, that we're accepting that children, we won't be driving acceleration in this area for a while, but this other thing is so important that it's worth us not driving acceleration in that area.
Or we hit our 50%, and this other thing is so important, we're spending our other 50% on it.
Yeah, correct.
I mean, I think that's where things like safety come in. Why are you looking at me like that, Tina?
Yeah. I think you're
Yes
correct.
or no?
That once you get to the
hear
point
you.
where you've made your priorities the priorities, then how you spend the rest of your time becomes that conversation. We say, okay, with the rest of our time, here are 5 different topics. We probably have time for 2 of them. Which 2 of these are most critical for us to invest the remainder of our time in? And that is what I'm saying is exactly the right policy conversation to be having as a board. But then you're not engaging things because social media said so,
Right.
Or because this is how I feel about it. You're engaging it because 7 people said, you know what, these things are priorities. We've got to dig into this, and that to me makes a lot of sense. It's always going to hurt to say here are 5 things, and we're only going to focus on these 2 because that's what we're choosing to focus on. All that's built in the conversation about communication and collaboration. I didn't get a consensus. Where people think you were on, I think people said approaching on that one. I think that was a consensus on.
I'm kind of lime green, but yeah, approaching.
That takes us to, let's finish out these last two really quick. They're a lot easier than the first three were. Unity and trust and continuous improvement. Where do you think you are with unity and trust? Approaching. What's one important thing that you'd want to see the board do next to try to move the needle on unity and trust? What's one thing that you'd want us to intentionally plan on to try to address in the next 3 months?
I don't think publicly, and not that we have to do this publicly, but just the ethics and the conflict of interest. I think there are times when probably me and Jennifer probably abstain from a lot of things given the ethics and conflict of interest.
All involved in a bunch of stuff.
It's who I work for.
Yeah.
Mine is my mom's a teacher.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
So but I just
employer and
think
family and
Yeah, so I just think us calling attention to that, like down at the bottom where it says that the board unanimously agreed during the most recent self-evaluation that all members have honored. So taking that time to just say, hey, are we honoring our ethics and conflict of interest? I don't recall us doing that as a board.
And one of the reasons this is here is because this whole section, Unity and Trust, is heavily inspired by a Covey book, I think it's called The Speed of Trust. And go read it yourself. But essentially, it suggests that imagine we have this hypothetical 10 units of energy, and if I trust my entire team, then I can devote those 10 units of energy in pursuing the priorities of our team. But if I know she's shady, then I'm going to only spend maybe 9 units of energy on the priorities and 1 unit of energy paying attention. What is she doing? Is she doing what she's supposed to be doing? Like, I'm looking over my shoulder. I'm looking back. I'm trying to figure out, are things happening the way it's supposed to be? And if I think she's shady too, well, now I'm putting 8 units of energy into the. And so the idea is that the more trust we have, the more quickly we can proceed as a team toward the priorities. It's a pretty obvious kind of thought when you think about it. And so the idea is, what are the things we could do that could increase the amount of trust so that instead of people looking over their shoulders at each other, be like, I know that Pierce is above board because here's what we agree to do, and I see that she's doing it. And when we could do that, then we spend less time worrying about, can I trust people, and that energy is freed up to focus on the path. And so I appreciate you surfacing that, because I think that's exactly what we run into. Is I run into a lot of boards where I swear every other call from one of the board members is, hey, well, such and such did. It's like, look, what do we need to do to help you get back focused on what's happening for children? Because every other phone call from y'all is about what is the person next to me on the day is doing. Like, what do we need to do to cure that so that we can actually put energy on children instead? And I don't think my experience is that's not a problem I've experienced this board to have. Or like, those are not phone calls I've received with people like, oh, well, what's Pierce doing? No, you all are properly allocating. But I think it's right to put a protective hedge to make sure it stays that way.
When I would add to that as well, I think because, we work collaboratively, it works until we get different people, and then maybe it won't work. And so maybe, I think we just have an agreement about how things run and the way we do things, like how things get on the agenda. Like, it's not written down. We just agree that this is some informal process, right? So I think that maybe being able to really work on, writing down those procedures, and that would help people like Christina, who are brand new and having to learn it all, would help establish more trust in the procedure.
But further to Tina's point, the best time to do that is when you have cohesion right now.
Right.
Like, you don't wait until the block is hot before we think about, hey, how do we create a peaceful block? Like, when the block is peaceful, that's the right time to put those systems in place. And that's what I'm hearing. And I'm just saying, I strongly agree that now, because you all are such a cohesive, like, y'all don't agree on everything. But that, to me, is not the measure of cohesion. It's, do we disagree in a productive manner? And I think you all actually demonstrate that about as well as any board that I work with right now. Because there's a lot of boards, man, they can't even be in the same room together. It's nasty. And that's not you all. You all are really adult, really professional in that way. But don't assume that it'll always be that way. The time to create a protective hedge is actually now, and to put those things into writing, so that if the next Christina is awesome as the current Christina, that our policies are already in place to help protect against that. Other reflections on unity and trust before we transition.
I think on the the unity and trust, the one that kind of stood out to me with the approaching student yellow.
Yeah.
here, I think it's important, like the policy or requiring that information be provided by their superintendent to one board member is provided to all board members.
Yeah.
That's one I think is important, just for like clarity, that we're hearing one message, we're understanding, because I think we've talked about this before, like really we need to understand things collectively, and being able to hear that in one way instead of like bits and pieces or picking things up in meetings and trying to puzzle it yourself. I think that to me would be very helpful.
Yeah, anybody who has multiple children probably quickly realized I don't have the exact same feeling in my heart about all of them. I know it's good. Like I all of them are loved, but just definitely in different ways. But it's really important as a parent that they not like experience like that. They're not feeling like well, you're being prioritized and you're being deprioritized. And so I may feel a little bit differently about all of them, but I do actually try to make sure that I'm attending to all their needs in a fair manner. I think superintendents are stuck in the same situation, that you don't ever want any of your board members to feel like, oh, well, she loves her more than she loves me. Like you don't want that. That is a bad dynamic to generate. And part of the way you protect against that is this idea that you create, like if I'm giving information, to Cole, then that means everybody else gets access to this as well. And the way that most superintendents, management teams accomplish this is they simply have a Friday update or something.
Yeah, we do a Friday update, and then if you notice when I respond to your questions, I include all the board members.
And we have the question list.
And you have the questions.
And you have all the
list.
questions, the answers.
And it's because of that, because sometimes one person may have a question that somebody else hadn't asked, but they may be thinking of it. So, and we always include Misty. So, and that's a way so that, everyone feels that they have all the information.
It's a really good practice. And again, it's something you all do well, but I've seen some other, it's a rookie superintendent mistake to make. And again, this is one of those areas where it's just not a weakness of you all.
It's not something this board always did. Current makeup, yes.
Gotcha.
But it doesn't go back too many years before different people were getting information.
Some people get answers and others don't.
That's right.
Yeah. And again, I think the time to build a hedge of protection around the current healthy environment you have is now while it's healthy.
Yeah.
And so if you were going to upgrade anything, that would be the time to do it.
And I would say that sometimes you don't get answers because we still don't have the answers. So I just noticed that, sometimes that we will provide something, you have a question. I just know the other day there was an email that came and James Bonds responded because we're still working on it, right? So sometimes the answer is not immediate. There needs to be, some other people brought in too to get the answer that we didn't initially think of. And then that information is provided. But I've always tried, since I've learned in my former district, let everyone know so that everyone is on the same page. Keep a record of all the questions that you've asked. So if you go back and have to review it. And that's why having Misty is so instrumental, because she keeps a log of all of that information. And then it helps you too if we ever need to go back, because you're getting so much information. It may be something I missed, right, in a log, and we always have her to go back and just look and provide those responses.
Any other reflections on this particular section, on unity and trust before we transition? I heard somebody say approaching. I don't know if there's anybody else. Okay. And then the last one is continuous improvement. Where are we at on continuous improvement?
maybe this isn't fair yet. We don't have enough time yet to do continue. I mean, we just started. Because I look at even what's in approaching, and we haven't done a lot of that yet. You know, we haven't.
Yeah, we're just starting
not
out.
far enough. We just started. We're not far enough along to do like recognition. We're not. You know.
All right, so
But we
we're not-
want to. We want to. It's a core
not-
value.
it's not there yet. Got it.
Growth mindset.
Anybody else? Sounds like we haven't gotten started on this one.
I agree.
So this is one we haven't got started on, but we're very quickly getting in a position to get started on it. All right, so we've self-evaluated. Anybody else keeping score, or is it just me?
I kept score. I think we were at 42. Is that right?
That's what I got.
Okay.
All right, so 42 out of 100. And so remember, we did this a long time ago. Anybody remember what the score was? Any guesses?
Low.
Under 10.
What's the lowest?
0.
Yes, there you go. Yeah, so we actually did this, I don't know, like 18 months ago or something like that, and the score was 0. And people were like, 0? And it's like, yeah, don't worry. You'll make progress. We just got to do the work. All right, so we've got stuff moving. Now we won't move from 0 to 42. And now that you actually have your goals and guardrails in place, it's going to get really easy to move with much more haste going forward. Yeah.
I'd like to say quickly, too, that a couple things. One is that we actually moved from 0 to 18, not 13%, actually 18%.
18%.
Yes, in terms of
Gotcha.
student-focused governance efforts.
Was this
Yeah.
wrong? Added wrong?
Yeah, I
Oh,
got it on
okay.
my little
You
thing.
Hey, you got to
I
double
just
check
was
that
looking
back.
at what
Yes,
was
sir.
given, so.
Yep, so we have a 5-point increase from
The
what was-
quarterly.
From when
There
we
you go,
started
there you
the
go.
meeting.
Absolutely.
18%. 18% is better than 13.
The other piece is I just again want to state in my passion for us becoming greater owners in our organization as a whole, becoming greater owners of SOFG and our work in that endeavor. I value all of the things that any part of our organization, from classified to unclassified employees, bring to the table. So whether that is our bus drivers, what have you, I do value that work. I do value their presence. I do value their efforts. And I see them as all connective and relative to student-focused outcomes. And that's why I, much like Tina and everybody else, I'm thinking in terms of how do we frame things in a way to identify with a question, is this a root cause? Is this something that is, as an input that has been distracted or disrupted, impacting our student outcomes in a way that gives us greater attention, not only to need to know about, but to act on. So I agree with everything you said, but I just wanted to make it clear, I value our group, our employees, our workers, our team, and I do see this in every way where we miss the mark in our adult behavior. It's latent or immediate impact on our kids being where we've planned for them to be.
So the other question is, you've run through this self-evaluation, and obviously we've made huge strides from the first time you did the self-evaluation. Now the question is, over the next 3 to 6 months, go back through it real quick. I'll give you 3 minutes to do so. What is, if you had to pick 1, 2, or 3 things that you most want to see the board work on to take that next leap in growth in this work, what would those things be? If you had to pick just 1, maybe 2, 3 things, what would you most want to see the board work on to improve so the next time we conduct this self-evaluation, that you are even further down the road? Floor is open. Anybody? If you've got, some of you have already mentioned some, but now this is your official opportunity. What are some things that you want to make sure the board does? Yeah.
I think one of the important things is something that you said is important, and that is preparation. And
Yeah,
that's something that each of us personally can do and actually do something about. A lot of these other areas require the entire board to do something. But that's one where each of us needs to take personal ownership and spend some time.
Yeah. So on the monitoring and accountability, I'd like to move closer to the time that we are spending on student outcomes being of the highest effective, time on it. And And I would submit to you that comes through practice, practice, practice. And so if anybody wants to practice, what we can do is we can carve out time for you to meet, do one-on-ones with myself or some of the other members of our coaching team. Once you receive your monitoring report, to schedule intentional time with one of the coaches or myself, and just go over it together. Say, okay, what are some questions do we have? Let's refine those questions. I've got another board. They have gotten better faster. And part of the reason they've gotten better faster, they started after you, and they're getting better faster than you are. But part of the reason is the majority of the board has made the commitment to do exactly what you said. They will meet with a coach in advance of the board meeting just to make sure that they are maximally prepared. It is additional uses of time, and so not all board members may want to behave that way across the country. But in this particular board, they do, specifically because they said the same thing. We want to get better faster than everybody else is getting. But really the only way to get there is you got to put in the time. And so just know that if that is you, if you want that, that the resource is already available. All you got to do is reach out, and we'll connect you with myself or one of our other coaches to get you every single month. You can hop on the phone. Hey, let's go through this together. Here's my list of questions. How would you fine tune some of these? And that will help you get better faster. So just know that is a standing invitation for anyone who wants to take advantage of it. Who else? So we got one item. We definitely want to strengthen the effectiveness of our monitoring. Anybody else? What are some key things you want the board to improve on over the next 3 to 6 months? Yeah, what do you got? I can't remember which one. Oh, yes, it was around the policies. Yeah, that's right.
Ethics.
Yeah, ethics policies. Unity and trust, some of the ethics policies.
We could also add the trainings that we complete yearly because our board goes above and beyond those trainings.
Yeah. Anybody else? Stuff that you really want the board to focus on. Yeah, Carol?
I'd like to see us take the policy diet seriously,
Yeah. That is a tough one to lean into.
and the committee diets, those two. So that probably in the next 3 months would just be wonderful.
Yeah. Policy diet and committee diet.
Policy diet?
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay. Wasn't sure I heard.
That was the term that I used earlier to describe the process of winnowing our, saying these things are going to be ours and all the rest of this is going to be administrative guidelines. That process is why I refer to it as a policy diet. Anybody else? All right. As a next step, what I'll do is work as usual with your board leadership, your management team, to try to map out what things you're going to work with the board on to improve on over the next several months. All right. So we have a smidgen of time left, and with that, I want to tackle the second topic, which we've actually covered most of the things about this topic because the superintendent annual evaluation is basically just a amalgam of all of your monitoring efforts from the year. So because we've already done a deep dive into monitoring practice, that part of superintendent evaluation we've already really covered. So that leaves the other part, and we want to start in the place, I think it was Michael who surfaced initially, or Carol surfaced. This is under monitoring and accountability, the last indicator under approaching focus. Somebody want to read that for me again? The last, on monitoring and accountability, the last indicator under approaching focus.
The superintendent is evaluated only on performance regarding the board's goals, guardrails, and interim goals and guardrails. The board considers superintendent performance to be indistinguishable from school system performance.
This is a tough expectation that not everybody wants to live. Why is it that boards don't want to only evaluate their superintendent on the board's priorities? Why is it that boards are often so reluctant to evaluate their superintendent on the board's priorities? Yeah.
I'm going to use an I statement. I am concerned that, let me restate that. I acknowledge that there are other nuances to leadership on that executive level that don't just entail the outcomes that we established or the goals that we established.
Goals and guardrails.
the goals and guardrails that we establish. They actually entail things that make that work, that also are measurable: leadership, communication, competency to actually perform various aspects of the work on a day-to-day. And we've done a very yeoman's job, a good job over many years in evaluating that. But I'll say in my work with this board, I think that we've put together a very sound way of looking at metrics on the part of the superintendent, treasurer, and the internal audit, to identify competencies, to assign things to them, to help really give us a good sense of what their leadership is in that space and what their impact is in that space. So again, for me, in short, it is acknowledging that I am concerned about the nuances that I believe are, in a certain kind of way, inputs even to personal, professional inputs to getting us to where we've set the goals and guardrails to be.
So,
I agree.
so let's think this. Use the term that you brought up earlier. What's the opportunity cost of doing that?
So actually, there shouldn't be an opportunity cost.
But there is.
So your argument is that there is, but my argument is that if we're strengthening our partnerships with our nonprofits and our public sector and the communication is there strong, that when it comes to our goals and our guardrails, our superintendent has somebody, really a community that is helping with that lift. If those competencies around community partnerships, engagement, engagement, communications is weak, then our superintendent is making it's a harder lift for the district. You don't have to do that work on your own in this type of community.
Are those guaranteed?
We got it to a pretty good space where when we think about how this community responded to COVID initially, yes, it was guaranteed. We had nonprofits, faith-based partners coming to us and saying, what do you need? How can we help?
If the superintendent increases partnerships, is that guaranteed to help you achieve your goals?
Yes, it was helping us achieve our goals.
No, that's not what I asked. I said, if the superintendent increases partnerships, is that guaranteed that you'll accomplish your goals?
I said, yes, it guaranteed that we accomplished our goals. When we think about how our students came out of COVID, yes.
I think it shows up in a lot of her current strategies. Partnership is a huge component.
So
I don't know if it's a guarantee, because what is a guarantee? But it's part of the strategy.
I mean, the guarantee was that our kids were in after-school programming. They were in smaller cell-based learning activities in our nonprofits. They were attending.
But I think the point is, she's going to have to be competent in order to achieve the goals. We don't have to measure that separately.
the challenge is it's not actually guaranteed. Is that there's not a one it's too multifactorial. For no professor at the university would say, I would take that on and ensure that this is a guarantee, that this one variable guarantees you this particular outcome. Like, nobody's going to be able to create a causal link there. The correlation, very likely. I'm not asking that, but causation, no. Nobody's going to lift that up, and that is the challenge. Is what we don't know is, of all the variables, which ones did in fact cause. We have beliefs about that, and we have ideas about that, but we don't actually scientifically know. That's the challenge. And so in the moment that you do make that decision to evaluate on other things that are not your priorities, just understand that is the bet that you're making. You're betting that, I'm betting that even if she doesn't do anything else except for this, that this will be enough to make sure that our goals get accomplished and our guardrails are honored. And the board just, certainly the encouragement is always go in open-eyed, that is the bet that you're making. But it is by no means guaranteed. Unfortunately, there's so little, like with the U.S. Department of Education, they put up the What Works Clearinghouse. Has anybody ever been at this thing? there's like 3 things that work. Like when you look at it, where they can actually say this definitively, yeah, if we do this and we do it to this level of fidelity, like part of the problem with the clearinghouse is that there are so few things, because the reality is it's so much of education is multifactorial and it's complicated. You have to make sure that the specific treatment matches the specific diagnosis, and that is not even static across the school district, that's variable. And so in this super multifactorial environment, you know, when they look at the What Works Clearinghouse, and you say, what are the things that, you know, we are clearly saying this absolutely works, there's very little there. And so what they actually did is they went back and they started showing things that didn't meet that threshold, but things that, you know, still had a pretty good shot. He's like, and so it's like there's still the What Works Clearinghouse and the, you know, what's probably a pretty good idea clearinghouse. But that's the challenge that you face.
Have you seen our
So,
competencies?
yeah, within the state of Ohio, the competencies are set there. And there's numerous standards. Those standards all feed into the competencies that we've laid out for the superintendent. And this is based on research that's been conducted. And I'm sure if we were to pull data and to look at when we have strengthened and strong partnerships and two-way communication, that our students are achieving better than when we don't have those.
I would say this. I would say that if we think about if we go back to 2019, prior to us getting an aligned strategy around our partners, there was no correlation. There was no ownership to where our data was prior to 2019. What we have now, I believe, is an aligned strategy. And one organization I can use right now is United Way in their Success by Third Grade, the Reading Success. We have intentionally partnered with them. We have 2 regions that they are going to work with, Region 1 and Region 3, specifically to increase literacy, because those are the 2 regions that we needed the most help. So we have purposely aligned our partners to strategies so that we can get the outcomes that we need. Another one would be City Year. City Year prior to this year was not working on any schools on the west side of Columbus. And we've now outlined a specific strategy for City Year and specific buildings so that we can get at those outcomes. So I agree with partnerships and aligned strategies. You can begin to see some work on some outcomes. I mean, I agree, when we think about What Works Clearinghouse and others, but I think we're heading in that direction, and we have some of them that are outlined.
Michael,
So I think that's where you
hold
need
on.
to
So Michael's had his
strengthen it.
hand
Yes.
for a long time.
I want to use your word guaranteed, but I want to reframe it.
Yeah.
I want to look at it, I want to position that prism a different way to say that certain things can be guaranteed touches, right? Certain things can be a part of the guarantee of getting us closer to next. And I believe that a lot of what you've heard in this conversation, particularly relative to how we have adopted the state's model of superintendent treasurer evaluation, and then how we've, in many different ways, modified that to what we see is what we value, has made it work. I'll take from, for example, the 8 characteristics, some of our readings, brother, the 8 characteristics of effective school boards. One of them is our collaboration, our ability to work collaboratively, not only with the executive level leadership, but our partners and internal folks within the organization and the community as a whole. So that's just one example of where that idea of leadership then becomes really important to our work and measurable as well. There are other research spaces that show where that those things that we're teasing out in that evaluation align with the goals and guardrails that we have established. We can't count on her to do what we need her to do if she can't lead the organization in a way that demonstrates that her staff has an effect and a focus on whole child. If they are focused on making sure that we don't deny children resources and things that they need to be effective.
The guardrails do that, not the competencies.
No, hold on. It's all relative, though. It's not separate, it's all relative. It's just a matter of how we look at something counterintuitively. Guardrails are just a counterintuitive look at what we established about what we want to achieve and what we will not allow to happen to achieve it. It's all relative.
So the challenge, so the only thing I'm putting out here is step one. There's no, if you are using the competencies because you believe there's a guarantee that if the superintendent does these things, that the goals will happen and the guardrails will happen, I'm definitively suggesting to you, you do not have the data to suggest that's a guarantee. What is, however, likely
Guaranteed touch, good doctor.
what is,
would
however,
definitely help.
likely a guarantee is that your superintendent will, in fact, focus on the areas and invest energy in the areas where she's being evaluated. I mean, and this is not true for her, it's true for all of us. If there is an area that your supervisor says, we're not going to evaluate you on this, and we are going to evaluate you on this, what is the reasonable person going to definitely spend some time on?
Well, it's not only what we're saying. And first of all, I think that the competencies as outlined actually work very well with the goals and guardrails. And, I think it's just about how we go back in and when we look at them, making better and closer ties, which we have actually started doing. I just think it's important to have, and two, maybe the two parts are not weighted the same, right? Maybe this part of the evaluation is weighted like 75% and the other's 25%. But I do think that in this city, the way that it works here, some of the things that we are evaluating her leadership on are critical. And the cross collaboration is one of those that is super important.
How do you measure that, by the way?
How do we measure it?
Yeah.
We have, I have to look at it. I don't remember off the top of my head.
One of the ways in which we do it is qualitatively. We've identified what those key categories actually are. And then we assign a score. I mean, we assign an assessment to where it's meets or doesn't meet.
Let me ask it differently. For any of these competencies, which one of the competencies do you all assign on a data basis rather than on a board assessment basis?
Well, one, I would say it's not just a board assessment. So I think each one of us goes through the competencies and provides examples for where the superintendent is meeting those or not meeting those. And the superintendent has the opportunity to respond as well. So I wouldn't say it's just the board doing it. It is really
So the state provides a rubric that you all are using?
yes. And we provide it provides the standards, and then we provide the examples for here's where you were, and we try to come up with the balance between where are we seeing most of the examples fall within the exceeds, the meet, the not.
So the state provides a rubric for collaboration, and you read that rubric, and you try to where.
No,
It's not a rubric. Don't put that. It's not a rubric.
No,
It's
But
a description of a
it's-
competence,
it's
a
a
definition of a competence.
definition of a competency. And then
Well,
that
how about
competency
we-
is on a
Can I say
continuum.
It's only
of
4
each-
minutes until 8:30. So how about we let you see it?
Can I just say one quick thing, though, because I think I just saw the reason why we don't want to have the competencies. Talisa has figured out that she needs partnerships in order to help achieve the third grade reading. She's figured out that she needs to have the United Way doing Region 1 and Region 3, all of which is collaborative, partnership, communication, all of the competencies. The one thing we just did to her by making it a competency, instead of her just going about doing what she needs to do to deliver the goals and guardrails, which is going to be by definition have competencies, she has to defend herself. Well, I did this partnership, and I did this, and I got city year here, and I did this. And we're forcing her to spend energy when, in fact, she's
don't
doing
think
all those
that's
things because she
fair,
has to
Carol,
achieve the
because-
goals and the guardrails.
Well,
Can I, in just your explanation, can I explain why she does need the competencies? Because these goals and guardrails can change. My assumption is that Dr. Dixon is going to reach these goals that she set out within the 5 years. So these are going to change in 5 years. Those competencies remain the same. My other thing is the tenure for a superintendent, 4 or 5 years. So if another
Three.
is 10, is it
10?
You about to stay for 10,
Yeah,
Doc?
10.
Okay,
I saw
you go to
10.
You just signed up
Let,
for 10.
So-
let the record show.
Signing up for 10.
That ain't happening. I'm too old for that.
So if we think about, the tenure of a superintendent coming in and again, goals and guardrails changing, the competencies stay the same for us as a board, as a really, I look at it as it's our values. These are another set of values that we are saying is important for how our superintendent leads this district.
And I'm not saying we don't encourage her to have partnerships or to do communication or to say, in this city, you got to do it this way. I mean, I think communicating and mentoring or whatever it is we do to help be servant leaders for her to achieve that stuff. I'm not saying we don't even have conversations about it, but what I'm saying is I just saw it happen right there. And I was like, she's trying to defend herself that she's the partner queen when she just is naturally doing it because that's in order to achieve the goals and guardrails. And she can't really, you can't do any of them without being competent.
But she should be able to do that with all the competencies. When it comes to policy and governance, she should be able to say, okay, this is why I'm bringing forth the academic policies that she brought forth to us to change those policies and say, here's the rationale for why administration is bringing those policies forward. That's a part of the competencies that now she can say, I'm the policy queen.
But AJ's point is, if we're asking her to prove she's the policy queen while at the same time we're asking her to actually get the kids to read.
No, I'm asking her to be a superintendent. That is
Yes,
what
we're
the
not asking her to
competencies
prove.
are.
We're saying provide evidence of what you're doing.
And it doesn't also mean that the way we have it or the way we're doing it now is exactly how we'll do it, because we didn't have the goals and guardrails to infuse in before. We haven't actually done this exercise of creating the next evaluation, right?
Once we really think about it, it might look very different.
Yeah, it could look different.
Is the last question I have for you on this topic, which is, if the superintendent can accomplish all of the goals and all the guardrails without doing well on your competencies, the question the board has to wrestle with, would that be acceptable? And the corollary to that is, if the superintendent accomplished the competencies, but it came at the cost of accomplishing the goals, would that be acceptable? Those are the questions you want to wrestle with, and those questions are grounded in the same thing we've been talking about this entire time. Is it the quantity of things you charge your administration with focusing on does in fact have an impact on their ability to focus on? And so I'm not saying your competencies are bad or horrible. I don't know that because I've not read the description of all that. I don't know anything about that.
They're behavioral based, right? So my answer to you is, she cannot accomplish these goals and guardrails without having the competencies of a superintendent.
That's true.
Exactly.
She cannot. And so as she is accomplishing the goals and guardrails, the competencies are demonstrated through her behavior, and that is what she is judged on in that section of the evaluation. I just, you haven't seen it, so why don't you look at it?
And then I have one question about this evaluation. Can baseline be included in here?
It should be.
Yeah, the baseline. Is, okay.
It's not. I don't.
We got the target. We got the actual. We got the meet or not meet. I think it would be important to include baseline.
So the baseline should be included on. So that's just a sample, so it's not all filled in. But like each of the goals, it should have the goals should state the baseline, just like your goals do.
So that 20. So the 23% would have been the baseline.
Yeah.
So we would literally have 0 in all of these and some of these for her.
So this is not your actual data. This is just
No, but that's what I'm saying. If we use this same format, so I'm concerned that this format will not show significant gains when they are made.
So it'll show whatever you all expected. So if you said that the baseline, if we're going from 50% of students will be able to do this thing to 80%, and we want to see a 5-point jump and then a 10-point, and so you kind of predict in advance. Here is where we started, and here's the expected. Here's what we expect to get by this time period. So that's why it shows one column. Where was our target? Where were we trying to get to? And then the next column talks about where did we actually get to? And so, yes, you define in your goals, you've already defined what all the baselines were. And then part of your work with the superintendent, she says, here's where I believe we can get by this year, and here's where I think we can get by this year and this year. And then each year what you're doing is you're evaluating, did we get to where we thought we could be by the end of this year? That's essentially what the evaluation is. And in this worldview, the evaluation is really if the superintendent has gotten academics to where it needs to be, and if your management team as a whole has honored the guardrails, then in this evaluation, the superintendent has passed.
So let me give you a very real example. In one of our monitoring reports, I want to say it was our reading for our younger students. As we were going through that monitoring report and looking at the data, we noticed with one data point, it would take us actually 19 years to actually get to where 100% of our students are, a significant number of our students were actually on target, right? And so what I feel with this graphic, the way that it's set up, again, I'm not sure that it's going to show us the significant gains when they're made, or also alert us to when there is a deficiency within the charting of the data.
Yes. So on this, basically, it'll say we expect it to be at 50% at the end of this year, and then on the actual, it'll say either we got to 45%, or we got to 50%, or we got to 55%, and So your superintendent is, predicting up front, saying we think we should be at 50%, and then you all looking at the actual data to figure out, did we hit that, did we fall short of that, or did we exceed that? So that's the analysis that this document is. This document is accomplishment. It's saying, did we accomplish the thing that we thought we could accomplish this year? That's it. It's actually not.
It doesn't chart out that it's going to take us another 12, 15.
Your goal does.
To get to the 80.
But the goal does.
That wasn't our goal. But
that's what I'm saying. So it's
if you look,
literally charting.
Yeah. So if you look in the goal,
we're getting there that year.
So if you look in the goal, it says here's where we're starting. Say we're at 30%, and here's where we're trying to get to. We're trying to, by this date, 5 years out, we're trying to go from 30% to 60%. So that's already, so in your goal, you've defined where we're starting and where we're going. What this is saying is each year in between that, did we make the growth that we thought we should make relative to where we're trying to get to?
Yes, but Kara, all I'm pointing out is that even in that year of growth, it's still not showing the limited growth that we've made with the entire picture. So in that year, you might get there, but then it might be taking you 7 to 10 years. Well, we need to point that out in the evaluation.
We can't hold her accountable for that.
So my point is, however we need to set up this visual, we need to make sure that we have the total perspective of how the data is moving.
Yeah, what are you thinking?
It seems as very clearly the one document we're talking about is very summative.
Yeah.
Very summative. The interim guardrail reports are what are going to give us that alert.
Along the way.
And absolutely, that ongoing, in the meantime, in between time, idea and assessment of where we are and where we're not.
And what's working, what's not.
So I totally understand what you're saying.
I would like it to be in this
because I
as
see
well.
some things, too, even in our timekeeping piece that shows some challenges just in that modeling. But just to answer that question particularly, the interim reports are going to be those real touch point areas where we identify, we're not where we should be, and that'll give us the idea how to adjust and all of that good stuff.
But I do think,
Very simplistic, though.
Tina's
That's
point,
all I'm saying.
whatever we
by
set
design,
as
that's
that
correct.
goal is the only thing that we have any right to hold her accountable for.
So that's the intention, that there should be so here's the thinking, is there should be a path for your superintendent if she accomplishes the things that you all said that she accomplished, that she should get, that is an automatic success. The way most boards evaluate in the competency model, all across the country, the competency models used. Even if the superintendent accomplished the things the board said, if the board didn't like the way she did it, then she could still, flunk her evaluation. In this model, we're saying if she accomplishes the things that the board says that she should accomplish on behalf of children, and if she honors the values the board says she should honor in her administration, then that gives you an automatic pass. That's the message here, and so it offers a certain amount of protection for a superintendent to say, if I got the job done, but board members don't like me personally, does that mean I got to go? And in most districts, the answer to that is yes. You can actually do the job and still get tossed out. Boards who are doing this work, our answer is our response is the answer to that should be no. That if the superintendent actually accomplishes what the board says that the superintendent accomplishes, that should be enough for the superintendent to automatically get a passing grade. Now, if she doesn't accomplish it, then you go back to the normal system of we're having a conversation about, did you accomplish, these things, and did you do it the right way, and did you have enough partnerships and all, and you default back to that. But if the superintendent actually accomplishes the things that the board asked, that our view is that board member opinion shouldn't be able to invalidate that. And that is
AJ.
Yeah.
So I think what I also heard, maybe it was Jennifer saying, or maybe we're all saying it, is where do you evaluate the behavior of for example, yes, the individual may have hit all the quantitative markers, but just before evaluation, now we have a 60% turnover rate. Or that it's 60% turnover rate. Now next year we're not going to hit it because now they've lost their staff.
But the thing is, you won't know that until next year. Like so here's the reality.
Well,
I've seen schools where, and I'm certain I'm not alone in this. I've absolutely seen schools where, you know what, we did not have the right leader here, and so where even though the leader was beloved, that if the leader can't get the job done, you don't keep the principal just because we don't want retention rates to look bad. And so, again, and the point that you just made, Ramona, is exactly my point, is that if what the superintendent had to do in order, I'm not suggesting this is the case, I don't know any of your principals, so I'm just running with what Ramona said, just because that's what Ramona said. If what your superintendent had to do to increase the quality of instruction that students are experiencing is turn over half of your principals, but that actually got the job done, but it infuriated the board, what I'm saying is that if it actually got the job done for children, then she should still get a passing grade for having accomplished that, even though the board was furious that the people that they know and respect and appreciate are no longer part of the organization.
It's the people that did the work that hit because it could be that the individuals that worked for that leader, because I've seen it, it could be the individuals that worked for their leader were the competent ones, but they weren't treated with respect, weren't valued, weren't appreciated, whatever acronym you want to say. And then the actual issue was with the leader versus the people, because there are people that
but so here's the
measures
question,
are met.
And
I'm just throwing that out there as how do you? I guess my question would be, how do you include the actions of where do you evaluate the person? Not only the you hit the mark. Where do you evaluate the competency of the person?
Yeah,
but isn't it
is
also?
the question.
Yeah, but
I don't need an
I want to
answer.
that. I do want to answer that because there is an assumption here, and so I want to be crystal clear about the assumption. The assumption is that those factors are indistinguishable. That either a superintendent can get the job done or they can't. And if they can, then they demonstrate, because remember, you've got 5-year goals. So somebody hitting year 1 goal and then tanking everything and missing year 2, they're going to be gone anyway.
Right.
And so if somebody is actually hitting your goals over a 5-year period, then the built-in assumption is that, yes, whatever behaviors made it possible to grow student performance over a 5-year period, those were the right set of behaviors, even if they weren't the exact behaviors that board members wanted to see. That is absolutely the assumptions built into this, is that the best measure of the effectiveness of a superintendent is what results did she create. That is the best measure of, does she have the qualities to be a superintendent? Not do 7 people believe that their understanding of the evidence determines that, but did she actually get the job done determines that. And the fear that I always carry is, if superintendents, like if I'm your superintendent, I know it's made it abundantly clear what you all value is that there have to be these community partnerships. And so I join your school district, I look around, and I don't see that the quality of instruction students are going to get through our partnerships is going to get our kids there. And then what I actually need to do is keep them at school 2 hours longer rather than send them to partnerships in the community. Then now the question is, am I going to keep them in school 2 hours longer when I believe that that is the best solution? Or am I going to send them to partnerships because that's what the board clearly expects? That is the fear that always lives in my heart, is what I want the superintendent to do is, as a board, we've said, make sure our children can do these things. And what I really want as a superintendent to do whatever it takes to accomplish that, even if it looks different than the things that I think it should look like. Because there are some communities where maybe partnerships, maybe there's just not the same level of capacity in the community that there is in the school. In that case, partnerships make less sense. In other places, the capacity in the community far exceeds the capacity in the schools. In those communities, partnerships make more sense. I'm just saying I would want the superintendent to make that call based on what is real in the community, not based on anything that the board's not willing to put in its guardrails. Now, if you put in your guardrails, if you say one of our guardrails, we're going to scrap one of our guardrails and we're going to replace it with, the superintendent may not, exclude community partnerships from her strategic planning, from her strategic plan. Well, now you've put that into your guardrails and you're saying that's one of the things. But the reason I'm okay with that is because you only get 5 of those. You only get 5 opportunities to say, this is a non-negotiable. And all I'm suggesting is if community partners is truly a non-negotiable, then delete one of your guardrails and say, this is actually more important than one of those. But by not doing that, what you say, how many competencies are there? There are like 6.
Really, the competency is cross-collaboration. That is what it is. Communication and cross-collaboration, partnership falls in that.
Yeah.
So that's the overarching competency.
And if people from the community show up and say, this superintendent is not communicating and collaborating with us, but the superintendent is actually significantly growing student performance, the question that I think the board has to wrestle with is that acceptable? And that's the only thing that, so what I'm not suggesting is, here's the right way and here's the wrong way. What I am saying is that I strongly encourage you to just always have eyes open around the more priorities that exist. So if we've got 5 guardrails, 5 goals, we've got 10 things, and then we add one more competency on it, now we've got 11. And all that means is the superintendent will now focus on 11 things instead of 10. But there is a net effect of being focused on 11 things instead of 10 things. That's the only thing I'm pointing out. And the board just has to make a decision. How many things do we want our superintendent to focus on? That's all. We've talked to this ad nauseum. We'll set it down. What you have in front of you, to use Tina's language, is this is a very simplified view of superintendent performance. The view is simply, did the superintendent accomplish the things that we said the superintendent should accomplish for this 12-month period? And when the answer is yes, what we're saying is the superintendent, good. If the answer is no, then we're saying the board then needs to have a conversation about, okay, what does that mean? Were there externalities, and so that's not a big deal? Were there not externalities, and it is a big deal? Then the board will discuss it. That's all that this document is trying to accomplish. It's saying, how do we just simplify our understanding of what is it we want her to do? And so what will happen is all of this is super premature, because when is your next superintendent evaluation?
June.
In June.
On the old one.
And that's what I'm saying. You are definitely 100% not evaluating your superintendent on this.
Right.
The reason we're talking about this right now is because I'm challenging you to be crystal clear with your superintendent by June on what the instrument for her evaluation will be in June of 2023.
Right.
And I'm definitely encouraging you to be super mindful about how many different priorities are we going to offer her. I always recommend, less is more. But whatever answer you all go with, what I'm definitively am telling you is the correct answer is she needs to know that this June so that she has her instrument in her hand all year long so she can know what she's being evaluated against. That's all. That's just a standard HR best practice.
Part of our standard practice as well.
Yeah. So we went through the two major things that we came here to do. We talked about board self-evaluation. We talked about superintendent evaluation. We have a set of next steps that I have. I will send your board leadership and Misty the notes so she can you all can get a distribution of all the notes I've taken, your scores and everything else. And then my next step is I'll work with your leadership to map out what are some of the things that you all said you want to work on over the next 3 to 6 months, and I'll work with your leadership team to figure out how to, what's the scope, what's the timeline for actually implementing those. I feel like I always come here and stir the pot, and so in that regard, I feel like I've been successful in that regard. Is just to challenge folks to just think through stuff in a variety of different ways, and where you land is where you'll land. But I definitely always just want to challenge folks to think through stuff, and so I appreciate your patience with me, because if you hated being challenged, you would have stopped inviting me back long ago. I enjoy being here. Madam Chair, back to you.
Thank you so much, AJ. We do enjoy it. We have to talk about it so we can improve and create the best governance model to make sure that our student outcomes are the focus. So we're in it, and we want to keep working at it. So thank you for this evening. And the last thing we'll need is just a motion to adjourn.
Second.
And hearing no objections, we are adjourned.
Thank you, AJ.
Thank you.
Always fun.
Thank you, AJ. Good night, everybody.